Tonight you are standing in the most powerful room in Victorian England. It is not the House of Commons. It is not Buckingham Palace. It is not the floor of the London Stock Exchange, thick with men in identical black coats shouting numbers at each other as though the world's survival depends on it, which in their minds it very much does. No, you are standing in a kitchen. Specifically, you are standing in the basement kitchen of a perfectly respectable terraced house, on a perfectly respectable street, in a perfectly respectable London neighborhood. Let us say Kensington, because Kensington in 1878 is exactly the kind of place that takes its respectability extremely seriously. And the room you are standing in is warm and smells of coal smoke and boiled mutton, and the faintest trace of something burnt that no one is going to admit to. It is a Sunday morning in January. Upstairs, the family, the Beresfords, let us call them, or the Hardings, or the Smythes, or any of 100,000 interchangeable surnames belonging to the comfortable, God-fearing, professionally employed English middle class. The family is preparing for church. Mr. Harding is struggling with his collar. Mrs. Harding is reapplying her gloves. The children are being buttoned into coats with the practiced aggression of people who have been doing this every Sunday for years and have never once enjoyed it. They will be gone for approximately 2 hours. And you standing here in this basement kitchen, in this room that does not appear in any of the floor plans the architect drew up for the builder who built this house, because basement kitchens in the 1870s were understood by architects to exist in a kind of spatial parenthesis, a footnote to the real house above. You are not one of the Hardings. You are Ellen. You are 19 years old. You have been awake since 5 o'clock this morning. You have already cleaned and reset 3 fireplaces, hauled coal from the cellar twice, prepared and served breakfast, washed the breakfast things, scrubbed the front step, and blacked the kitchen range, a job that involves a substance called blacklead and a wire brush and produces the kind of mess that makes you understand viscerally why your hands look 60 years old when you are 19. You are not going to church. The Hardings are going to church. You are going to stay here and prepare the Sunday roast, which needs to go in the oven at precisely 10:30 so that it will be ready at the precise moment the Hardings return, which is something Mrs. Harding has explained to you in the particular tone of voice she reserves for instructions she believes you will forget. You will not forget. You never forget. But here is what you are thinking right now at this exact moment, as you hear the front door close and the street goes quiet. The Hardings left half a decanter of port on the sideboard last night. There is cold roast chicken in the larder, left over from Saturday. There is a small piece of cheese that Mrs. Harding said nothing about one way or another, which in a kitchen like this constitutes implicit permission. And the newspaper that Mr. Harding reads and then folds and places in the rack in the parlor, the newspaper that you are technically not allowed to read, because reading newspapers is considered by Mrs. Harding to give servants ideas, is sitting right there in that rack, and has been since Thursday morning. What happens next is not dramatic. That is precisely the point. What happens next is that Ellen sets the roast in the oven at 10:25 rather than 30:30, eats a little cold chicken, reads 3 pages of the newspaper, and puts it back exactly as she found it. She does not poison anyone. She does not steal the silver. She does not commit arson or murder or any of the colorful crimes that Victorian sensation novelists love to attribute to the servant class. She just breathes, takes up slightly more space than she is supposed to, exists for approximately 2 hours as a full human being rather than a domestic appliance. And here is the thing that should make you sit up a little straighter. The Hardings will never know. They can never know, because the most dangerous weapon available to the Victorian servant class was not a knife or a bottle of arsenic or a box of matches. It was something far more insidious and far harder to prosecute. It was knowledge. The servant knew exactly where everything was, what everything cost, how everything worked, and who everyone really was when the curtains were drawn and the guests had gone home. The servant held the house. The employer merely occupied it. And in Victorian England, there were more than 1.5 million people holding other people's houses. Welcome back to the quiet past. I'm glad you're here. Before we go any further, a quick note for the new arrivals. If you enjoy long-form narrative history that doesn't condescend to you and doesn't put you to sleep, this channel might be for you. Like and subscribe if you want more. We don't make it weird, but it does genuinely help. And if you have thoughts, corrections, or historical grudges you'd like to air publicly, the comments are right there. We actually read them. Occasionally, we're wrong about something. We try to be honest about it when that happens. All right, let's go below stairs. The army you hired, who they were, how many there were, and why this number should shock you here is a number that tends to land like a dropped tray. In the 1871 census of England and Wales, the single largest occupational category, larger than coal miners, larger than factory workers, larger than agricultural laborers, was domestic service. 1.5 million people, in a country of approximately 22.5 million. 1 in every 15 people in England and Wales was, in 1871, employed in someone else's house. Not making things, not farming things, not building things, cleaning, carrying, cooking, and generally maintaining the domestic infrastructure of people who could afford to pay someone else to do it for them. And this was not a static number. It grew. By 1881, it was 1.6 million. By 1891, 1.7. By 1901, the last census taken in Queen Victoria's lifetime, it approached 2 million. The servant population of Victorian England was roughly equivalent to the entire population of Ireland in the 1890s. It was larger than the entire standing army of the British Empire. It was bigger than the population of most European capitals. Think about that for a moment. Now, 80% of those 1.5 million people were women. This is worth sitting with. Because when we talk about the Victorian servant class, we are talking in practice about a workforce that was overwhelmingly young, overwhelmingly female, overwhelmingly rural in origin, drawn from agricultural counties to the expanding industrial cities where the middle class was multiplying faster than anyone had quite planned for, and overwhelmingly without legal protection of any kind worth mentioning. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. First, the structure. Because Victorian domestic service was not a single thing, it was an elaborate, rigidly stratified social ecosystem, and understanding where everyone stood in it is essential to understanding what they were willing to do and what they were willing to risk. The Great House, a hierarchy in full. Let us begin at the top, in the world of what contemporaries called the Great House, the country estate or the grand townhouse of the aristocracy or the very wealthy upper middle class, where a domestic staff of 20 to 40 people was not unusual, and where the hierarchy below stairs mirrored, with eerie precision, the hierarchy above. At the summit sat the butler. The butler was a man always. His domain was the dining room, the wine cellar, the silver, and the front door. He managed all the male servants. He was, in the social world below stairs, a figure of considerable authority and considerable income. A senior butler in a great house might earn between £60 and £80 a year in the 1870s, plus his room, his board, and certain perquisites. We'll come back to what perquisites meant in practice, because it is one of the great euphemisms in Victorian economic history. To the butler's left, metaphorically speaking, sat the housekeeper. The housekeeper was a woman always. Her domain was the female servants, the linen, the still room, where preserves and cordials and medicines were prepared, the housekeeping accounts, and anything Mrs. Beeton might have described as the smooth running of the household. She was addressed as Mrs. regardless of her marital status. The Mrs. was a courtesy title indicating seniority, one of those small Victorian distinctions that carried enormous weight in the world below stairs. A senior housekeeper in a great house earned £40 to £60 a year and was, in practical terms, the most powerful person in the domestic economy of that house. Then came the cook, a position of tremendous importance and often tremendous temperament, the cook being understood by everyone in the Victorian household to operate under slightly different rules than everyone else, because the cook could make your life a misery in ways that were too immediate and too intimate to ignore. A cook who was in a bad mood expressed that mood through the food, and the food was the most visible, most immediately felt output of the entire domestic enterprise. The cook knew this. The cook used this. Below the cook, the lady's maid and the valet, personal attendants to the mistress and master of the house respectively. These were positions of peculiar intimacy and peculiar power. The lady's maid dressed her mistress, styled her hair, cared for her clothes, accompanied her when she traveled, and was therefore witness to an extraordinary range of private moments: the morning face before the rouge, the correspondence left on the dressing table, the whispered conversations with a friend that stopped the moment someone else entered the room. The lady's maid knew things. Everyone knew the lady's maid knew things. This was not a comfortable knowledge to live with. Below those positions, the footman, whose primary qualification appears to have been height and calves. This is only slightly an exaggeration. The footman was a visible to guest servant, the person who answered the door and stood behind chairs at dinner and handed things around on trays, and in an era when male servants were essentially decorative as much as functional, an employer who was serious about her social reputation wanted her footmen to be tall, well-built, and presentable. Some households specified height requirements. Some paid footmen in ratio to their height. The Victorian footman was, in a very real sense, human furniture, and the men who took these positions were aware of this, and most of them did not find it nearly as romantic as the novels would suggest. The coachman managed the horses and the carriage, which in a prosperous household before the 1890s represented a capital investment of several £100s and an ongoing maintenance cost that was a significant portion of the household budget. The coachman had his own hierarchy, grooms, stable hands, perhaps a page, and operated in a semi-separate domain, the stables, that gave him a degree of physical remove from the house that most servants did not enjoy. And then, the housemaids. The housemaids, if you want to understand Victorian domestic service in its truest form, not the romantic version of it, not the Downton Abbey version of it, but the actual lived reality of it, you start with the housemaid, because the housemaid is where most of the work was done and most of the workers were. The housemaid cleaned. She cleaned everything, all the time, every day. She was up at 5 or 5:30 to clean and reset the fireplaces before the family woke, because a Victorian family in a house with fireplaces could not encounter the evidence of yesterday's fire. That would be disturbing. She dusted and swept and polished and carried. She made beds and changed linen and emptied chamber pots, which in a house without indoor plumbing, and in 1871, most houses did not have indoor plumbing, meant hauling a ceramic vessel containing human waste down 3 flights of stairs and disposing of it without spilling any and without being seen doing it by anyone. The invisibility requirement was not incidental, it was structural. A first housemaid in a large house earned perhaps 16 to 20 pounds a year. An under housemaid, a younger girl in her first or second position, earned perhaps 10. A scullery maid who worked below the cook in the kitchen doing the washing up and the heaviest kitchen labor might earn as little as 6 pounds a year. 6 pounds per year. Room and board were included, yes, but the room was often in the attic, cramped and cold and shared, and the board, while adequate, was of a quality deliberately distinct from what was served upstairs. There was an upstairs menu and a downstairs menu, and the difference between them was a quiet, daily reminder of where everyone stood. The middle-class home, the one-maid problem. Now let's descend from the great house, because the great house, with its 30 servants and its butler and its housekeeper, was not where most Victorian domestic workers spent their careers. Most Victorian domestic workers spent their careers in what we might call the modest middle-class household. And if the great house was the visible, romanticized face of Victorian domestic service, the modest middle-class household was its grinding, largely undocumented reality. The Victorian middle class was an anxious class. It had money, some money, but not the indefinite, unearnable money of inherited wealth, and it spent a significant amount of that money trying to look as though it had more than it did. This is what Thorstein Veblen would later call conspicuous consumption, and one of the most conspicuous things you could consume in Victorian England was labor. Having a servant was not merely practical. It was a social statement. It meant you had achieved something. It meant you had arrived. The problem was that having arrived required maintaining a standard that was considerably expensive. The middle-class household of the 1870s and 1880s might employ 2 servants, a cook and a housemaid. A slightly less prosperous household might employ one, the maid of all work, or, as she was known with a cheerfulness that nobody who held the position seems to have fully endorsed, the general servant. The maid of all work was, in practical terms, doing the labor of 3 or 4 people. She cooked, she cleaned, she answered the door, she did the laundry. She hauled coal and carried water and blackleaded the range and scrubbed the front step and sewed and mended and marketed and preserved, and if children were present, sometimes cared for them too. She did this 6.5 days a week. She had Sunday afternoons and perhaps one evening a week as time off. She slept in a room that was frequently the coldest, dampest, or most airless room in the house, not because her employers were sadists, but because that was how houses were built. The desirable rooms were where the family was, and the servant room was what was left. And she was 19 years old, or 22, or 15 in many cases, because there was no lower age limit on domestic service and no legal restriction on the hours a servant could work. Hannah Culwick, one of the very few Victorian servants who left an extended documentary record of her working life, began domestic service at the age of 8. She worked as a domestic servant for 50 years. In her diaries, which she kept at the request of her secret companion Arthur Munby, a barrister and writer with an obsessive and complicated interest in working-class women, she recorded, in extraordinary practical detail, what a day in her life looked like. On a single day in 1860, she catalogued, cleaning the flues, sweeping and dusting the hall, laying the fires, washing up breakfast, cleaning the front steps, cleaning the boots, scrubbing the kitchen, washing the vegetables, preparing dinner, serving dinner, washing up dinner, and then beginning the preparations for the next morning. No holidays, no sick leave, no pension, no guaranteed notice period. If you gave notice and your employer refused to provide you with a character, a written reference without which you could not get your next position, you could spend months unemployed, living on nothing, trying to find work in an economy that ran entirely on personal recommendation. If your employer dismissed you on the spot, as they had the legal right to do, and withheld your character, you had in practical terms very little recourse. The magistrates' courts heard servants' cases occasionally, but the legal framework governing domestic service was largely unchanged since the 1823 Servants' Act, which classified servants as a category distinct from ordinary wage workers and subject to different rules. Distinct rules, different rules, rules that consistently favored the employer. This is the world we are entering. This is the world in which the rebellion took place. And now you start to understand why, when it started, when the resentment crystallized into action, when the action was disguised as incompetence or accident or simple bad luck, it was so difficult to see. It was designed to be. The terms of occupation, the contract nobody signed, and the rules nobody questioned, there is a peculiar document at the center of Victorian domestic life, and it is peculiar primarily because it does not exist. There was no written employment contract between a Victorian servant and her employer. None. Not standard practice, not usual form, not the general expectation. The relationship between a domestic servant and her employer in the 1870s was governed by verbal agreement, tradition, Mrs. Beeton's opinions, the Servants' Act of 1823, the local magistrate's interpretation of the same, and above all by the character. The character. Let us dwell on this for a moment, because the character is one of the most quietly totalitarian instruments in the history of labor relations, and it deserves your full attention. A character, or character reference, was a letter from your previous employer testifying to your conduct, your honesty, your industry, and your general suitability for employment in a respectable household. Without a character, you could not, in practical terms, get a new position. Registries, the employment agencies of the day, which operated from high streets in every major city and charged both servants and employers a fee, would not place a servant without a character. Most employers would not interview a servant without one. The character was held by the employer. They did not have to give it to you. They could refuse to give it. They could give you a bad one. They could give you a tepid one, the dreaded, "She is honest and sober, and I have no particular complaint against her," which every experienced housekeeper reading it understood to mean that something was wrong, even if the exact nature of the wrongness was unspecified. They could give you a partial one, "Good cook," but, and here is the part where you feel the mechanism clearly, the threat of a withheld or damaged character was routinely used as a tool of control. A servant who complained about working conditions could be silenced by the implied threat to her character. A servant who asked for a wage increase at the wrong moment could find that, when she eventually sought a new position, her reference was less glowing than she had hoped. A servant who was dismissed, fairly or unfairly, with or without cause, had to ask her dismisser to speak well of her in writing, and that asking required a particular quality of humility that many Victorian employers seem to have found deeply satisfying to receive. The system was not designed by anyone to be cruel. It evolved. It was simply the way things worked. And the way things worked ensured that the balance of power in any dispute between servant and employer was, almost categorically, with the employer. There were exceptions. There were legal exceptions. The magistrates' courts did occasionally rule for servants in cases of wrongful withholding of wages or clearly unjust dismissal, and there were practical exceptions which mattered more. An extremely good cook in a household that valued good cooking had leverage that the theory of the character system didn't quite account for. A servant with a long relationship with a trustworthy employer had a kind of informally accumulated social credit that provided some protection. And as the century progressed and domestic servants became slightly harder to find, a trend that accelerated dramatically after 1880, as factory work and shop work and eventually clerical work opened up to women as alternatives, the market began to shift just slightly in the servants' favor. But in 1860, in 1865, in 1870, the system was still fully and ruthlessly operational. And so let us talk about what the terms of that system actually were. The hours a senior housemaid in a London household in 1870 might reasonably expect to work between 14 and 16 hours per day. On a busy day, a dinner party, a house full of guests, a major cleaning event like the spring clean or the pre-Christmas clean, the hours could be longer. On a Sunday, with reduced duties, they might be 12, in theory. In practice, the reduced duties of Sunday frequently included cooking a full Sunday dinner, laying and clearing the table, washing up, and preparing the rooms for the following Monday. The 1833 Factory Act had limited the working hours of children in textile mills to 9 hours per day. The Factory Acts of the 1840s extended protections to women in factories, limiting their working day to 12 hours. Domestic servants were explicitly excluded from every Factory Act passed in the Victorian period, every single one. The rationale, when anyone bothered to articulate it, was that the domestic home was a private space and not subject to industrial regulation. The family fireside was sacred. The state did not intrude. And the servant who lived in that home was protected, as the argument went, by the quasi-familial relationship between employer and employed. The idea that a good mistress cared for her servants as she would care for her own children, providing food and shelter and moral guidance, and a character reference that was worth more than any wage. This argument was made by people who did not have to get up at 5 in the morning to black-lead a kitchen range. The wages here are some figures from the 1870s and 1880s, drawn from household account books, registry records, and the surveys conducted by social investigators like Charles Booth and Seabohm Rowntree. Butler, £40, £80 per year housekeeper, £30, £60 per year cook, good, £25, £45 per year lady's maid, £25, £35 per year first footman, £25, £35 per year coachman, £25, £40 per year first housemaid, £16, £22 per year under housemaid, £10, £16 per year kitchen maid, £10, £18 per year scullery maid, £6, £12 per year maid of all work, £9, £16 per year. These figures included room and board, which was real value, but they need to be understood in the context of what a comparable industrial worker was earning. A skilled factory operative in the 1870s might earn between 30 and 50 shillings per week, considerably more than a housemaid's annual salary, with more consistent legal protections and the freedom to go home at the end of the shift. The servants' wages were paid monthly or quarterly in most households, and frequently in arrears, meaning the employer held weeks or months of earned wages at any given moment. If you were dismissed before the quarter, you might receive nothing for the period already worked. The disputes this generated were a significant portion of the caseload of Victorian magistrates' courts in London and the major cities. There were also the deductions. Some employers deducted the cost of broken china, which was common enough practice to warrant an entry in Mrs. Beaton's advice on managing a household. Some deducted the cost of spoiled food or damaged linen. Informally, across many households, the servant understood that any mishap, any accident, any piece of carelessness, any inexplicable disappearance of a household object might result in a corresponding disappearance from her wages. You can see the mathematics of resentment beginning to take shape. The rules, a selected compendium. Every household was different, and within every household the rules were set by the mistress of the house according to her own temperament, her experience of previous servants, and her reading of the household management literature that the Victorian publishing industry produced in extraordinary quantities. But there were certain rules that recurred so consistently across enough records and memoirs and household guides that they can be described, without much exaggeration, as standard. Rule the first: invisibility. The servant was not supposed to be seen, or rather, she was supposed to be seen only when required, when bringing in the tea, when answering the door, when serving at table, and at all other times to move through the house as silently and unobtrusively as possible. Some great houses had back staircases, specifically so that servants could move between floors without crossing the family's path. In houses without back staircases, servants were expected to flatten themselves against the wall if they encountered a member of the family in a corridor, to step aside, to look at the floor. The spatial logic of the Victorian house was designed around this requirement. The kitchen and servants' quarters were in the basement, below the family, or at the top of the house, above them. The two worlds were connected by stairs that were architecturally distinct from the main staircase, narrower, uncarpeted, unlit. The dividing line was real and material, built into the walls and floors of the house itself. Rule the second: silence. The servant was not supposed to be heard. She was not to speak unless spoken to by a member of the family. She was not to whistle, sing, or make noise while working. She was to move quietly, which is a not insignificant demand on someone who is hauling coal scuttles and carrying dinner trays and scrubbing things on her hands and knees. The silence requirement extended to what the servant was not to say as much as how she was to say it. She was not to comment on the family's affairs. She was not to share information about the household with outsiders. She was to have no opinions about the family's personal life that she expressed to anyone who might transmit those opinions back to the family. What she said in the kitchen, below stairs, among other servants, that was another matter entirely. We'll get to that. Rule the third: no followers. A follower was a servant's personal visitor, a friend, a suitor, a family member, who came to the house to see the servant. The no followers rule was near universal in Victorian domestic employment. No visitors to the servant in the employer's house, period, except in explicitly specified circumstances and with explicit prior permission. The practical effect of this rule was to substantially sever the servant's social connections. She might live in, at any given moment, a neighborhood far from her home parish, far from her family, in a house where she was not permitted to receive anyone she knew. Her evenings were spent in the kitchen or the servants' sitting room if the household ran to one or her own room. Her Sunday afternoon off was her primary opportunity for human connection with the outside world, and it was 2 hours per week. The no-followers rule was justified on multiple grounds. Morality: unmarried men visiting unmarried female servants was obviously dangerous to everyone's virtue. Security: strangers in the house, and the ever-present anxiety about what the servant might say to a visitor about the household. It was a rule about control over access, information, and emotional sustenance, and it was enforced with varying degrees of strictness, but rarely not at all. The violation of the no-followers rule was one of the most common grounds for dismissal in Victorian domestic employment records. It was also, not coincidentally, one of the most commonly resented rules in every servant memoir and working-class testimony from the period. Rule the fourth: church. Many employers required their domestic servants to attend church services, sometimes the family's own church, sometimes a church considered appropriate for the servant class. This was part of the quasi-familial rhetoric of Victorian domestic service, the idea that the employer was in some sense responsible for the moral development of their servants, that running a good Christian household meant ensuring that the people who worked in it were also in a spiritually improving environment. The servant's experience of this requirement was, in practice, more varied than the theory suggested. For some servants, particularly those far from their home communities, the church was a genuine source of social connection, a place where you might know people, where you could speak to someone who wasn't your employer. For others, it was simply another demand on the 2 hours Sunday afternoon that were theoretically yours. Rule the fifth: deference. The form of address between servant and employer was asymmetrical in the specific Victorian way. The servant addressed the master as sir and the mistress as ma'am. The children of the household were addressed as master or miss with their first name, regardless of their age. A 12-year-old child was therefore addressed with more formal respect by the cook than the cook was addressed by anyone in the household. The employer addressed the servant by her first name, or in some great houses, by a name chosen for her by the employer. It was not uncommon in houses with multiple footmen, for example, for the footmen to be called James or John regardless of their actual names, because the employer wanted consistency and felt that learning individual names was more effort than the situation warranted. To rename someone is, in a quiet and not quite articulable way, a significant act. The servants noticed. The character, again we need to return to the character reference once more, because it is genuinely central to everything that follows. The Servants' Characters Act of 1792 had attempted to regulate the practice by making it illegal for an employer to give a false character, and by specifying that a character had to be in the form of a signed, dated letter. In practice, enforcement was minimal, and the market in characters was significantly less regulated than this suggests. By the Victorian period, there existed a shadow economy around the character. Servants who had been given bad characters or no character by a vindictive or dishonest employer could sometimes obtain alternative references from friends, former employers further back in their employment history, or in the less reputable registries, from registries themselves, which in some cases appear to have offered to supply plausible-sounding character letters for a fee. This was fraud. It was also in many cases survival. The servant who had been unfairly dismissed and given a bad character faced a simple choice: lie or starve. Many chose to lie, The lie was understandable. It was also criminal. And when it was discovered, when a new employer wrote to the named referee and discovered the letter was fabricated, the servant faced dismissal again, and now a criminal charge on top of it. The system manufactured dishonesty and then prosecuted it. This, too, was noticed. What the manual said Mrs. Isabella Beeton's book of household management, published in 1861 when she was 24 years old and based largely on advice columns she had written for her husband's periodical, was the defining text of Victorian domestic management. It has never been out of print. It is still in print. You can buy it right now. Mrs. Beeton compared the mistress of a household to the commander of an army. She compared the cook to a general. She provided lists of duties, timetables of work, salary scales, menus for every occasion from a family dinner to a formal ball, recipes for everything from mulligatawny soup to a dish involving 12 turtle eggs that you very much hope she never actually made for anyone. She also provided extensive guidance on how to manage servants, how to hire them, how to supervise them, how to treat their minor illnesses with the household medicine chest, the contents of which are an adventure in Victorian pharmacology, and how to dismiss them. Her tone on the subject of servants is the tone of someone managing a resource. It is not unkind, exactly. It is practical. It is the management literature of its time. The servant in Beeton's pages is an employee of a very particular kind, one whose labor, loyalty, and personal conduct are all subject to the employer's direction, and whose interior life is not really the employer's concern except insofar as a contented servant is a better servant, and therefore worth maintaining in a condition of reasonable happiness. The remarkable thing about Beeton, and this is not a compliment so much as an observation, is how completely she takes for granted the system she is describing. It does not occur to her, or at least does not appear in her book, that the people she is managing might have opinions about being managed, that they might resent the hours, that they might resent the silence requirement, that they might every so often express that resentment in ways that did not appear in any inventory and could not be itemized in any account book. The manuals told you how to run a household. They did not tell you what the household was thinking, the economy of resentment, what it felt like, and why that mattered. Let us be very specific about something. The Victorian servant class was not, by and large, an angry class, not openly, not visibly. Not in the ways we generally associate with labor discontent, not in strikes, not in riots, not in the kind of organized collective action that the trade union movement was producing in the mines and factories of industrial England during these same decades. There was no servants' union of any significance in the Victorian period. There were no servant strikes that anyone remembers. There was no Chartist moment for the kitchen maids. The reasons for this absence of organized action are worth understanding because they are exactly the reasons the resistance took the form it did. Servants, unlike factory workers, did not work in the same place as other servants. They worked in private houses, dispersed across the neighborhoods of every city and town in England, separated from each other by walls and streets and the physical geography of middle-class domestic life. A factory worker had colleagues. A servant had at most 2 or 3 co-workers in the same house, and a much larger network of acquaintances in neighboring houses. But this network was informal, unstructured, and severely limited in when it could meet, because the no-followers rule, because the limited time off, because the requirement to live in the employer's house, which meant that after work you went upstairs to your room rather than to a pub or a meeting hall or anywhere that collective grievance could be organized. The dispersal was structural, and it was, to be entirely clear, enormously convenient for the employing class, whether or not anyone designed it with that convenience in mind. Servants also had a powerful incentive not to be openly discontented. Open discontent was grounds for dismissal. Dismissal meant a compromised character. A compromised character meant unemployment. The chain of consequences was short and brutal, and it kept a great deal of anger quietly below the surface. But the anger was there. Let us count the reasons. The gap between theory and reality. Victorian household management literature operated in a register of mutual obligation. Mrs. Beeton, Samuel and Sarah Adams in their 1825 Complete Servant, and essentially every piece of advice literature directed at the employing class, positioned the relationship between employer and servant as one of reciprocal duty. The employer provided a home, food, wages, and moral guidance. The servant provided labor, honesty, and loyalty. The language was quasi-familial. The servant was part of the household in a way that an industrial employee was not. This rhetoric was real. Many employers believed it. Many servants experienced it as real. There are genuine testimonies of servants who spent decades with a single family and experienced something genuinely resembling familial affection on both sides. But the structural reality undercut the rhetoric at almost every turn. A family member does not need a character reference to move from one family to another. A family member does not risk losing everything they have worked for if the family decides they are unsatisfactory. A family member does not answer to Mary when her name is Jane because the household already has a Mary and it would be inconvenient to adjust. A family member does not eat at a different table from a different menu than everyone else. The gap between the familial rhetoric and the employment reality was felt keenly, and it produced a particular kind of grievance, the grievance of someone who has been told they are valued and simultaneously treated as though they are replaceable. That particular grievance is one of the most corrosive in human experience. It has a specific texture, not rage exactly, but a slow, steady erosion of goodwill. The feeling that your loyalty is being traded on for the benefit of someone who would not extend the same loyalty to you. In the Victorian servant, this erosion could take years, but it almost always took some form. The social death of service there was also something else, something harder to name but visible in nearly every servant testimony from the period. Being a servant made you invisible to the social world that you moved through, not just to the family, to the wider world. In the street, in the park, in the market, anywhere a servant in her uniform or her apron was seen, she was legible as a servant, and that legibility placed her outside the social category of person with an interior life in a way that was daily, relentless, and grinding. Hannah Culwick in her diaries records an incident in which she cleaned a pair of boots belonging to a middle-class visitor and then moments later served that same visitor tea, and the visitor showed no recognition whatsoever that the girl who had cleaned her boots and the girl who was now bringing her tea were the same person. The visitor looked through her. Hannah was furniture that moved. She recorded this without bitterness. She recorded almost everything without bitterness, which is itself an act of extraordinary self-discipline. But she recorded it. The invisibility was not always experienced as dehumanizing. Some servants internalize the invisibility as a kind of freedom, the freedom of someone who can move through spaces unobserved, who knows things that other people don't know because they have been trusted with access to rooms and conversations and private moments that the visible people don't share. The invisibility cut both ways, but it still cut, and the servants knew it. The question of the body Victorian domestic work was hard physical labor, and this is a point that the romanticization of the period tends to gloss over in ways that are worth correcting. Consider what a housemaid actually did, in specific physical terms, in a typical English household in 1870. She hauled coal. In most houses, coal was delivered to a coal cellar at the base of the house and carried in scuttles to each fireplace on each floor. A coal scuttle containing enough coal to fill a household fireplace weighed approximately 20 pounds. A housemaid serving a household with 6 fireplaces carried the equivalent of 120 pounds of coal per day, in addition to everything else. She cleaned with cleaning materials that were significantly more caustic than modern equivalents. The blacklead used on ranges contained graphite and often sulfuric acid. The cleaning agents used on silver and brass often contained ammonia or strong alkalis. The charring women who scrubbed stone floors used raw lye. There was no notion of occupational health in domestic service, and the hands and forearms of a long-term housemaid showed it. She worked in temperatures that tracked the weather, because the upstairs rooms were heated by the fires she lit in the morning and unheated once those fires went out. In January, a housemaid cleaning an unlit room might work for hours in near-freezing temperatures. In July, the kitchen, with its range going all day, might approach temperatures that in any other context would be considered a health hazard. The knee. Victorian housemaids spent significant portions of every day on their knees, scrubbing floors, cleaning grates, laying fires. Housemaid's knee, a painful inflammation of the bursa in front of the kneecap, was a recognized medical condition by the 1860s. It appeared in medical textbooks under that name. It was described as an occupational condition. Its treatment was rest. The irony of prescribing rest to a housemaid will not be lost on you. The physical toll accumulated. Servants who were interviewed in later life described bodies that had aged ahead of their years, hands that had been permanently altered by years of cold and caustic chemicals, knees and backs that carried the record of decades of kneeling and lifting and carrying. This was the cost, paid in the currency of the body, for wages that averaged 10 to 16 pounds per year. The specific insults, and then there were the small things, not the grand structural injustices, though those were real and large. The small things, the daily accumulating texture of what it actually felt like to work in someone else's house under these conditions. The food left aside for the servants that was yesterday's food, the food the family did not want. Not always, in many households the servant table was adequate, even generous, but often enough that it appears in memoirs, often enough that it was the specific grievance articulated by specific people in specific records. The uniform. Many employers required their servants to wear a prescribed uniform, a morning dress of a particular color and cap and apron for daytime work, an afternoon dress of black with white cap, an apron for serving duties when there were guests. The uniform was frequently provided by the employer at the servant's cost, deducted from wages. Some uniforms required the servant to appear more formally dressed than she would have chosen for herself, and in specific and visible ways. The cap, particularly, was resented in many accounts as a marker of subordinate status that was impossible to remove in public without announcing that you were a servant who had removed her cap. The bell, the servant's bell. In a Victorian household with a bell system, which most middle-class houses of any pretension had installed by the 1860s and 1870s, the servant was summoned by a bell, and the bell could ring at any time. You could be eating your dinner. You could be, in the brief free time of the afternoon, in your room. The bell rang and you went upstairs. The bell marked the fundamental asymmetry of the arrangement. The family had needs, which were expressed by ringing the bell, and the servant had the obligation to stop whatever she was doing and address those needs. There is a particular quality of servitude in the bell that the people who rang it perhaps did not fully register, because they rang it without thinking. The people who answered it thought about it all the time. The specific kindnesses and why they sometimes made it worse here is a counterintuitive truth, and it matters for understanding what follows. Many Victorian servants worked for employers who were, by the standards of the time and in many objective respects, decent and even kind people. Employers who provided good food, comfortable rooms, fair wages, occasional gifts of clothing or money on special occasions, genuine concern for the servant's health and welfare. And yet, in many testimonies, it is precisely in households of this kind that the resentment was most complex, because the kindness operated within a framework of total power imbalance that the kindness could not undo. The employer who gave her cook a Christmas box and asked after her family was still the employer who could dismiss her without warning, withhold her character, and fundamentally control her life. The kindness was generous. It was real kindness, not performance, but it was kindness from a position of complete authority, and complete authority does not stop being complete authority just because the person wielding it is occasionally generous with it. A servant who worked for a cruel, capricious employer at least had the clarity of knowing her enemy. A servant who worked for a genuinely kind employer had something harder to navigate, an employer she actually liked, in a system she had every reason to resent, and the daily cognitive labor of holding both of those truths at once. The acts of quiet rebellion that emerged from that tension are in some ways the most interesting ones. The rules of erasure, how a society makes 1.5 million people disappear. You are standing at the top of the servants' staircase. It is 1875. You have just come from the second-floor landing, where you collected Mrs. Harding's breakfast tray from outside her bedroom door. The tray is heavy. The back stairs are narrow, uncarpeted, unlit except by the small window at each landing. They smell of polish and something slightly damp. You are going down to the kitchen to wash up, and you are doing this on the back stairs rather than the main stairs because Mrs. Harding's guests sometimes use the main stairs in the morning, and the guests must not see you carrying a breakfast tray. Or rather, they must not have to see you carrying a breakfast tray. The distinction is subtle, but it is exact. You are not literally invisible. Everyone in the house knows perfectly well that someone carries the breakfast trays, someone cleans the rooms, someone lights the fires. These tasks do not accomplish themselves, but the mechanism by which they are accomplished, is supposed to be kept out of view. The performance of domesticity was meant to seem natural, effortless, as though the clean house and the warm rooms and the prepared food had materialized on their own without the intervention of anyone whose labor you had to think about or feel awkward about. This is what we might call the social magic trick of Victorian domestic life, and like all good magic tricks, it required infrastructure. The architecture of disappearance, the physical design of the Victorian house, was partly constructed around making the domestic apparatus invisible. The basement kitchen placed the kitchen, and its associated noise, smell, and labor below the level of the main house, accessible to the street by the tradesman's entrance at the bottom of the front steps. The tradesman used the door that went down, while the family and guests used the door that went up. This was not accidental. The division of the entrance into two distinct routes, one for the genteel, one for everyone who actually kept the house running, is literally carved into the stone of thousands of Victorian townhouses that still exist today. Walk down any Victorian terrace in London or Edinburgh or Leeds and look at the front steps. There will be below the main entrance, usually a lower door reached by steps leading down rather than up. That is the tradesman's entrance. Behind it is the kitchen. The two worlds shared the same building and lived in completely separate spatial planes. The back staircase, where you exist in the current moment of this narration, was another element of this architecture of disappearance. The great houses had always had them, servant passages that ran through the walls of the house and allowed staff to move between floors without crossing the family's path. As Victorian house design evolved and as more middle-class homes were built to something approaching this model, some version of the back stair or back passage became standard in any house with pretensions. The effect was to split the house into two, the front house and the back house, the visible house and the working house, the house the family lived in and the house the servants occupied. These two houses shared walls and ceilings and floors. They breathed the same air. But they were understood, in the social geography of the Victorian household, as distinct spaces with distinct rules, and the membrane between them was maintained with considerable care by both sides. The naming of parts let us return to the question of names, because naming is always a question of power. In a Victorian household, the servant was addressed by her first name, or by a standardized name chosen for her, or sometimes by her job title: cook, housekeeper, occasionally just girl. These were not insults as such. They were the linguistic conventions of the relationship, and both parties understood them as such. But there was an asymmetry. The servant addressed the family by title: Sir, Ma'am, Miss Alice, Master Thomas. The children were addressed with more formal respect than the servant received from anyone. A 12-year-old was Master Thomas. The woman who had cooked his meals and cleaned his room for the past 6 years was Bridget. This was so normalized as to be invisible to the family, and servants who wrote about it rarely described it as a wound exactly. It was simply the air they breathed. But in households with multiple servants, the hierarchy below stairs sometimes generated its own naming conventions, and these conventions are quietly fascinating. The servants addressed each other by full name or by formal title within the hierarchy: Mr. Jenkins for the butler, Mrs. Thomas for the housekeeper. Below stairs, there was a formality that mirrored and perhaps compensated for the informality of how they were addressed upstairs. The butler, addressed above stairs as Jenkins by the master and perhaps my good man by guests, was Mr. Jenkins to every person in the servants' hall. He had recovered his dignity at the bottom of the back stairs. The presumption of guilt, one of the most consistent and most damaging aspects of the Victorian servant relationship, was what might be called the presumption of guilt. The servant was assumed, until demonstrated otherwise, to be a potential thief. This is not an unfair summary of the practical arrangements of most Victorian households. The silver was locked away when not in use, the wine cellar was locked, the food stores were locked, the housekeeper held the keys and recorded the contents, and inventories of household goods were kept partly for insurance purposes and partly to provide a baseline against which disappearances could be detected. These precautions were not irrational. Theft did occur. We will talk about this extensively, but they were total. The presumption was total. Every servant, regardless of their individual history, operated in a household environment that treated them, structurally, as a managed risk. The effect of being continuously treated as a risk is not always what the managing class expected. Some servants internalized the assumption and were motivated by a kind of defiant honesty. I will not steal because I refuse to be what you think I am. Others responded to being treated as a thief by becoming one, on the reasonable grounds that they were going to be suspected regardless, and they might as well have the benefit. And many operated somewhere in the middle, in the gray economy of perquisites and small appropriations that existed in every Victorian household, and whose moral status was contested by everyone involved. The confinement that was not called confinement, let us be direct about something. A live and domestic servant in Victorian England was, in a meaningful sense, not free to leave, not legally. Legally, she was a free person who had entered a voluntary employment relationship and could give notice at the agreed interval, typically a month, and depart. The law was clear on this, but practically, she lived in her employer's house. She had no apartment, no rented room of her own, no address that was hers. If she left without completing her notice, she might not receive her wages for the current period. She would certainly not receive a character. Without a character, she could not easily get another position. Without a position, she had no house. The live-in arrangement that made domestic service in some ways more secure than other forms of employment, you always had somewhere to sleep, always had food, was also the arrangement that made leaving extremely difficult and made staying a condition that was enforced not by bars and guards, but by the simple, implacable logic of having nowhere else to go. Many servants stayed in positions they hated for precisely this reason. Many stayed in positions where they were underpaid, overworked, disrespected, or some combination of all three, because the calculus of leaving pointed to outcomes that were worse than staying. And the employer knew this, not necessarily consciously, not necessarily with any intention of exploitation. But the structure of the relationship ensured that the employer's power to dismiss was always more credible than the servant's threat to leave. And this structural fact shaped every interaction in ways that were rarely articulated and almost never examined. The body as subject to others, the Victorian employer had, by custom and sometimes by explicit household rules, a degree of authority over the servant's body that would be unthinkable in any modern employment relationship. The no-followers rule was partly about controlling the servant's romantic and social life, but it went further than that. The employer could and did specify what the servant wore, the uniform, when the servant slept, the curfew, where in the house the servant could go, the back stairs, the servant's hall, the kitchen, not the family rooms, not the family parlor, not the garden except on specific occasions, and in many households, what the servant could eat. Not in a cruel sense necessarily, the intention was not starvation, but in the practical sense that the servant's diet was determined by what the household kitchen provided for the servant's table, which was in turn determined by the household budget, which was in turn set by the mistress. In many households, the servants were also expected to be in bed by a specified time, and the house was locked at that time. If a servant was not inside before the house was locked, she had to wake someone to let her in, which was both embarrassing and grounds for a reprimand. If this sounds familiar to anyone who has read about the conditions in institutional settings of various kinds, hospitals, boarding schools, prisons it should. The live and domestic servant existed in a total institution in the sense that sociologist Irving Goffman would later use that term, an environment in which sleep, waking, eating, working, social interaction, and personal behavior were all regulated by the same authority, in the same physical space with continuous oversight. She was not a prisoner. She was not an inmate. She was legally and formally an employee. But the structure of her daily life had more in common with those institutional environments than with what most people in the 21st century would recognize as employment. The art of the invisible weapon passive sabotage and the thousand small rebellions, here we arrive at the heart of it. Here is where you should pay close attention, because this is where the history of Victorian domestic service stops being a straightforward account of labor conditions and becomes something considerably more interesting. A case study in how power is resisted when open resistance is impossible. The American historian James C. Scott wrote a book in 1985 called Weapons of the Weak, and in it he described a form of political and economic resistance that he observed among Malaysian peasant farmers, a form of resistance that did not involve confrontation, did not involve organization, did not involve any of the conventional markers of political action. It involved foot dragging, feigned ignorance, deliberate misunderstanding of instructions. Quiet sabotage disguised as incompetence, the small, deniable, accumulating acts of a class of people who cannot afford open resistance but will not fully surrender. Scott called these the weapons of the weak. He was writing about Malaysian peasants in 1985. He could have been writing about Victorian domestic servants in 1875, because the toolkit was virtually identical and the logic driving it was the same. When open resistance is foreclosed by the power dynamics of the relationship, when striking is impossible, when organizing is impossible, when complaint leads to dismissal and dismissal leads to destitution, the resistance does not disappear. It goes underground. It gets quiet. It becomes invisible. An invisible resistance in a Victorian household was, when you examine the evidence, remarkably sophisticated. The slow work, the most basic weapon, the most deniable, the most widespread. The slow work was simply working more slowly than you could work, not ostentatiously, not in a way that could be pointed to as deliberate idleness, but with a consistent, sustainable, maddening inefficiency that reduced your actual output over the course of a day by perhaps 15 or 20% compared to what you were capable of producing. The slow work was the domestic equivalent of what factory workers called soldiering, the deliberate restriction of output that Frederick Winslow Taylor famously complained about in his early 20th century work on industrial efficiency. Taylor observed that workers across multiple industries consistently produced at well below their maximum capacity, and he attributed this to a combination of laziness and deliberate collective action to prevent piece rate wages from being cut. Victorian servants had no piece rate wages to protect, but they had the same basic insight. You cannot compel maximum effort. You can compel presence. You can compel the appearance of effort. You cannot compel a person to move at her fastest speed or think most cleverly or bring her full attention to every task. The slow work was everywhere. It shows up in employer complaints, in letters, in diaries, in the household management literature, in Punch magazine satirical pieces, in parliamentary discussions of the servant problem. The word that appears over and over is dawdling. The Victorian servant was, according to her employers, constitutionally inclined to dawdle. The employers rarely asked why. The broken thing was more targeted. China breaks, glass breaks, things fall, slip, get knocked. This is the natural entropy of a busy household, and in any household with servants, a certain rate of breakage was expected and budgeted for. The household accounts kept by domestic employers of the period regularly include line items for replaced china, replaced glassware, replaced candles, replaced this and that. The question is, what was the baseline rate of this natural breakage, and what was the rate of breakage that reflected something less natural? The employer could never quite answer this question, and this was precisely the point. A housemaid who disliked her situation had access to an enormous number of fragile objects. The family's good china was stored in a dresser in the dining room. The Venetian glass fruit bowl sat on the sideboard. The ornamental figurines on the parlor mantelpiece were, famously, always in some peril from a careless duster. The question of whether any specific broken object was an accident or an act of will was unanswerable, because the circumstances in which things broke were circumstances in which accidents did genuinely happen. Some employers responded to this ambiguity by introducing the breakage deduction, the policy of deducting the cost of broken items from the servant's wages. This was meant as a disincentive. It was also, for the servant who was breaking things deliberately, a form of payment. She was, in effect, purchasing the satisfaction of the breakage. The employer was funding it. The breakage deduction also created a secondary incentive. The servant who was charged for accidents she had not committed had a rather good reason to stop being careful about accidents she was causing. The accounts of Victorian domestics and the household records that survive are genuinely difficult to parse on this question. The breakage rates recorded in Victorian household account books are, in the aggregate, higher in some kinds of households than in others. Higher, in particular, in households with high turnover, high rates of complaint in employer diaries about servant conduct, and markers of generally poor employer-servant relations. This is not proof of deliberate sabotage. But it is what you might expect to see if deliberate sabotage were mixed into the natural breakage rate in roughly the proportion that the circumstances would suggest. The bad dinner the cook was, within the Victorian household, in a uniquely powerful position relative to the rest of the servant class, and the source of that power was precisely the power of the bad dinner. The dinner, in the Victorian middle class and upper class household, was the primary performance of domestic respectability. It was the moment at which the household's social reputation was most directly at stake. If guests were present, a bad dinner was a social catastrophe. If no guests were present, a bad dinner was still a significant domestic event. The husband came home to it, or the family sat down to it, and its badness was felt directly and immediately. The cook controlled the dinner. And the cook's control was very difficult to override, because the production of food requires both skill and intention, and the employer generally could not tell the difference between a cook who had produced a bad dinner through incompetence and one who had produced it through choice. The deliberately bad dinner was real. It appears in Cook's testimonies, in accounts of household disputes, in the records of registries that found themselves mediating between employers complaining of poor cooking and cooks insisting that the kitchen facilities or the marketing budget were inadequate for the menu being demanded. It appears in the novels of the period, which is a data point in itself. Novelists tend to write about things that readers recognize. The cook in a temper produced a dinner that was, somehow, not quite right. The meat a little underdone or a little overdone, the sauce thinner than it should be, the pudding dense, collapsed, gummy, nothing that could be pointed to as the result of deliberate action. Everything that produced the specific unpleasantness of a dinner that promises much and delivers little. The employer who complained about the dinner had to do so to the cook's face, which meant navigating the cook's personality and the cook's potential response, which might be a tearful denial, a dignified refusal to acknowledge the criticism, or in a cook of sufficient seniority and self-possession, a patient explanation of exactly why the dinner had turned out as it had, in which the employer's contribution to the problem was made diplomatically but unmistakably clear. The cook was not an oppressed minor. The cook was a professional with leverage, and the bad dinner was one of the ways that leverage was expressed. The wasted supply beyond the broken thing in the bad dinner, there was the wasted supply, the deliberate or quasi-deliberate inefficiency in the use of household resources that transferred value in diffuse and deniable ways from the employer to the servant, or simply from the employer to nobody. The coal fire that burned too hot and consumed more coal than necessary, the candle left burning in a room longer than needed, the soap used liberally on a wash that could have been done with less, the tea brewed strong when the household budget notionally ran to a weaker brew, the food that was, in the vagueness of the kitchen accounts, used without being precisely accountable. None of this was dramatic. Individually, any one instance was trivial. Cumulatively, across a household, across a year, it amounted to a quiet tax on the employer's resources that was real even if it was invisible. The household management literature was deeply aware of this. Mrs. Beaton's chapters on the management of the kitchen and the still room are replete with advice about keeping precise accounts, checking the stock regularly, monitoring the consumption of coal and candles and soap and tea. The advice is entirely reasonable as household management. It is also, if you read it from a slightly different angle, a manual for detecting the wasted supply. Whether the waste was always deliberate is genuinely uncertain. Some of it was genuine inefficiency. Some of it was the gap between the servant's household skills and the standards of the household she had entered. Some of it was the natural entropy of any complex domestic operation, but some of it was not accidental, and the employer in most cases could not tell the difference. The deliberate misunderstanding, this one, requires a special appreciation because it is the most cognitively sophisticated of the quiet weapons. The deliberate misunderstanding was the act of doing what you were told, literally and precisely and entirely incorrectly, because the instruction was ambiguous and you chose to resolve the ambiguity in the way that least served the employer's intention. Clean the parlor produced a parlor in which the surfaces had been dusted, but the fireplace had not been cleared, because the instruction said clean and not clean the grate specifically. Prepare the guest room produced a guest room that was made up with the wrong linen, because the instruction had not specified which linen. Tell the butcher we need a joint for Sunday produced a joint of the wrong cut or the wrong weight, because the servant had told the butcher exactly what she was told to say, and the butcher had exercised his own judgment. The deliberate misunderstanding required the servant to maintain a particular kind of innocence, not the innocence of someone who doesn't know better, but the performed innocence of someone who was simply following instructions, who can look directly at you and say, with complete sincerity, "But you said to," and be technically correct. It was a form of malicious compliance, and it was infuriating in exactly the way malicious compliance always is, because the person you most want to blame is yourself for not being more precise in your instructions. Victorian employer diaries and letters are full of a particular category of complaint that reads, in retrospect, as the frustration of someone on the receiving end of this. The servant who can never be relied upon to understand what one means. The servant who does exactly what she is told and nothing more. The servant whose work is perfectly correct according to the letter, but somehow never quite what was wanted. This complaint reveals the mechanics of the misunderstanding. The employer wanted a servant who anticipated needs, who understood the spirit of instructions, who applied judgment and initiative in service of the household's goals. The servant, in the mode of quiet resistance, chose not to. She did what she was told. Nothing more, and this was, within the absolute letter of her duties, entirely unimpeachable. The maintained secret there was one more weapon in this arsenal that was perhaps the subtlest of all, and it was this: the servant who knew something she did not share. The servant heard things. She was in the room when conversations happened. She carried the post and brought in visitors and was present at exactly the moments of household life that the family's social performance required to be witnessed only by each other. She heard arguments. She observed the symptoms of illness before the family acknowledged them to each other. She saw the letters left on the desk, the face in the morning before the social performance was assembled, the behavior of the family's children when the parents were not watching. All of this knowledge was formally not hers. She was supposed to have not heard, not seen. The invisible servant who moved through the household like a ghost was not supposed to process and retain what she encountered, but she did. And the fact that she did that every well-run household contained, in its servant or servants, a repository of private knowledge about the family, was a source of power so obvious and so intimate that it was never quite acknowledged openly by either side. To acknowledge it would have been to acknowledge the mechanics of the relationship too clearly, and both employer and servant had reasons to prefer a more comfortable fiction. But the power was real, and both parties knew it. The servant who did not gossip, who did not leak what she knew to neighbors or tradespeople or her own family, that silence was a gift. It was a gift that was not legally required and not enforceable, and that could be withdrawn. The employer who treated her servants well received that silence, generally, as a matter of course. The employer who did not treat her servants well sometimes discovered that the silence was not, after all, guaranteed. What goes missing the great Victorian household economy of petty theft, let us be precise. The word theft is a legal category with a specific meaning. What we are about to discuss operates in a much murkier zone, a gray economy of household appropriation that existed somewhere between acknowledged perquisite, tolerated practice, genuine dishonesty, and survival strategy, and the correct label depends enormously on who is doing the labeling and what they are calling by what name. Start with this. The Victorian household ran on a system of acknowledged and unacknowledged benefits. The acknowledged benefits were the perquisites, perks, as we now say, which is where the modern word comes from. The perquisite was a formal or semi-formal benefit attached to a household position. The butler had a known perquisite of the candle ends, the stubs of candles used at dinner, which were his to sell or use as he chose. The cook had a known perquisite of the dripping, the fat rendered from roasted meat, which collected in the dripping pan and was, in many households, considered the cook's to sell to the local rag and bone man. The lady's maid had the perquisite of her mistress's old clothes. The coachman had the perquisite of hay and oats left over from the horse's allocation. These were not theft. They were understood, agreed upon supplements to the wage, so well established as to be part of the effective compensation package of the position. Then there were the unacknowledged benefits, the food eaten in the kitchen that was not strictly allocated to the servant's table, the coal fire in the servants' hall that burned a little longer than it needed to, the tea brewed with the employer's tea for the servants' use. The small appropriations of household resources, not dramatic, not the walking out with the silver, that happened constantly, everywhere, in almost every Victorian household, and that both parties tacitly understood to be happening and almost never formally acknowledged. And then there was what we might honestly call theft, the taking of things that the servant knew the household would miss and notice, the walking out with something of genuine value. All three of these existed simultaneously. Disentangling them requires care and requires understanding what the people involved understood themselves to be doing. The perquisite economy, the perquisite system, was genuinely ancient. It predated the Victorian period by centuries. In the great households of the 17th and 18th centuries, the acknowledged perquisites of senior servants could represent a substantial portion of their effective income. The butler who controlled the candle ends in a house that spent heavily on entertainment had a meaningful supplementary income. The cook who rendered the dripping from a house that ate well could sell a significant quantity of fat each week. By the Victorian period, some of these perquisites were being squeezed. Middle-class employers, conscious of their household budgets and advised by management literature to take precise account of what the household was consuming, sometimes refused to acknowledge perquisites that their servants considered established entitlements. This produced a category of dispute that doesn't quite look like theft from the servant's perspective and doesn't quite look like legitimate grievance from the employer's perspective. Consider the dripping. In the cook's understanding, the dripping was hers. This was the established practice of every household she had worked in. The rag and bone man called on Thursdays. The dripping went out to him. She received perhaps 6 pence or a shilling, depending on the quantity, and this money was hers by right. In the new employer's understanding, informed, say, by Mrs. Beeton, who had opinions about dripping, the dripping was a household resource that could be reused in cooking or sold for the household's benefit. The cook was taking something that belonged to the employer. The dispute this generated was real and serious and recurs repeatedly in records of servant-employer conflicts. From the cook's point of view, she was defending an established entitlement. From the employer's point of view, she was stealing. The law was on the employer's side. The law was almost always on the employer's side. But the cook's sense of moral legitimacy was on her own side, and this sense was not groundless. Food, the constant negotiation, the appropriation of food was so widespread as to be almost definitional of domestic service. Every Victorian household management guide mentions it. Every survey of domestic servants that asked about food appropriation confirmed it. Every servant memoir from the period, the few that exist, discusses it, usually with a matter-of-factness that suggests the writer assumed the reader would not be surprised. The specific form this took varied enormously. At the most modest end, the cook tasted the food more liberally than was strictly necessary. The kitchen maid snacked on kitchen scraps. The housemaid, cleaning the dining room after breakfast, ate the remnants of bread or toast or preserves that were otherwise going to be discarded. At a more deliberate level, the cook prepared slightly more than was needed for a dinner, calculated to produce leftovers that would form the servant's supper. This might or might not have been encouraged by the employer. Many employers accepted this arithmetic as a reasonable arrangement, but it gave the cook discretion over a portion of the kitchen's output. At a more still deliberate level, the cook purchased provisions for the household, and the prices recorded in the household accounts were not always precisely the prices that the tradespeople had actually charged. The difference, a penny on a pound of butter, a halfpenny on a pound of flour, accumulated, invisibly, into a supplement to the cook's income that she understood as compensation for the gap between her wages and her labor. This was called commission by some cooks and overcharging by some employers, and the terminology tells you where each party stood. The tradition of the cook taking a small commission on household purchases was so widespread as to be an open secret in Victorian domestic culture. Tradespeople knew about it. Experienced employers knew about it. New, idealistic employers arriving at their first household did not know about it, discovered it, and were subsequently engaged in a cat and mouse game with their cook about whether the accounts accurately reflected reality that could last the entire duration of the employment relationship. Mrs. Beeton advised that the mistress should do her own marketing, or at least check the household bills against market prices regularly. This advice, if followed, would have eliminated a significant portion of the supplementary income of Victorian cooks. The extent to which employers followed it is an open question. The extent to which it made a practical difference when they did is another. The silver question, and now we arrive at the category of theft that was not gray at all, that was clearly, legally, unambiguously theft, and that occupied a disproportionate amount of space in the Victorian employer's imagination relative to its actual frequency. The theft of household silver. Let us be honest about the numbers here. Actual theft of significant household valuables by domestic servants did occur. It is documented in police records, in court proceedings, in insurance claims, in newspaper reports. The servant who walked out with the spoons was a real person, not a fiction. But the frequency of significant household theft by domestic servants was considerably lower than the level of anxiety it generated in the employing class would suggest. The anxiety was disproportionate, and the disproportionate anxiety is itself data. The data from Old Bailey records for the Victorian period, which have been extensively analyzed by legal historians, shows that domestic servants were convicted of theft at rates that, while significant, were not dramatically higher than one might expect from a class of workers who had consistent unsupervised access to valuable household goods. The remarkable thing, given that access, is perhaps how infrequently the silver actually walked out the door. The reason for this is the character system. The servant who stole something significant and was caught was finished, not just dismissed, prosecuted. Transportation was still a possibility until 1868, and imprisonment was routine. But more broadly, a conviction for theft made every future employment document worthless, made every registry inaccessible, made the normal routes to a new position closed. A servant who stole and was caught had, in professional terms, destroyed herself. This calculus was not always made correctly by every servant in every moment of temptation, but it was made, and it resulted in a level of restraint that the employer's anxiety didn't quite credit. What the employer was really afraid of was not the infrequent major theft, but the constant, invisible, unverifiable, entirely plausible minor appropriation, the small things. The things that might be missing or might have been used or might have been there all along and the employer had simply miscounted. This fear was rational because the small things were going missing all the time in almost every household. The case of the missing candles were expensive. In a Victorian middle-class household before the widespread adoption of gas lighting, candles were a significant household expense. They were stored under lock and key by the housekeeper in many establishments. They were allocated by the household to different rooms for different purposes. They were also regularly appropriated by servants who used them in their own rooms after the household had retired. The servant's room was, in most households, not provided with allocated candle time beyond a certain point. The servant was expected to be in bed and asleep. If she wanted to read or write or sew or simply not be in the dark, she used candles that were, strictly speaking, the household's candles. The candle economy in Victorian households was a small drama that played out thousands of times a day across England. The housekeeper checked the stock. The stock was less than it should have been. She could not prove who had taken candles or when or whether the discrepancy was consumption or miscounting. She made a note in the accounts. She told the mistress. The mistress spoke to the servants vaguely about household economies. Nothing changed particularly. The candles continued to disappear. The Kate Webster case. When it all went catastrophically wrong now, I have to tell you about Kate Webster. Because we have been discussing petty and not so petty appropriation and the gray economies of Victorian domestic life and the careful, deniable, invisible nature of most servant resistance. And now I need to tell you about the case that was none of those things. March 2, 1879, Richmond, Surrey. Kate Webster was an Irish woman in her late 20s, of considerable physicality and considerable turbulent personal history, who had arrived in England years earlier and spent much of the intervening time in a cycle of petty crime, imprisonment, and domestic employment that was somewhat harder to maintain between prison terms than she might have wished. Her employer was Mrs. Julia Martha Thomas, a retired schoolteacher who lived alone in a house in Park Road, Richmond, a respectable neighborhood, a respectable house, a respectable widow who kept house carefully and ran her domestic arrangements with a particular precision that was, by some accounts, rather trying for the domestic staff. By March 1879, Kate Webster had been with Mrs. Thomas for approximately a month. The relationship was not going well. Mrs. Thomas had complaints about Kate's work. Kate had complaints about Mrs. Thomas's manner. The specific content of these disputes is now difficult to reconstruct because one of the parties to them was about to cease to exist. On the evening of March 2nd, Kate Webster murdered Julia Martha Thomas. What followed was not a swift or clean crime. It was, by any historical account, one of the most gruesome disposal operations in the history of Victorian murder. Webster dismembered the body. She boiled portions of it in the kitchen copper, the large vessel used for boiling laundry. She packed the remains in a black bag and a wooden box, and then she tried to sell the rendered fat to a local pub landlord and his wife, Henry and Kate Porter, telling them it was dripping that she was getting rid of because her employer was giving up housekeeping and no longer needed it. The Porters thought the dripping tasted unusual. This sentence has haunted me since the first time I read it. The Porters thought the dripping tasted unusual. The case broke when the dismembered remains were discovered in the Thames and traced back to Webster through a series of connections that eventually brought the Richmond police to Park Road. Mrs. Thomas was reported missing. Her house appeared to have been occupied by a woman who had been selling off her employer's furniture and silverware and passing herself off to Mrs. Thomas's friends and neighbors as the newly returned owner of the house. Kate Webster was arrested, tried, and hanged at Wandsworth Prison on July 29, 1879. The case was a sensation. It dominated the newspapers for months. It produced the predictable round of commentary about the dangers of domestic service, the impossibility of knowing the true character of the women you invited into your home, the terrifying proximity of the servant class to the intimate spaces of the household. The Kate Webster case was an extreme. It was entirely outside the range of what most Victorian servants did or considered doing, but it was a mirror held up at a grotesque angle of the intimate power that the servant class held. The servant had access. The servant knew the house. The servant was in the kitchen. The servant could, in extremis, do with the household what could not be undone. Most servants did not do this, but the employers knew the access existed. And after March 1879, they thought about it rather more than they had before. The information wore what they knew, how they shared it, and why it terrified the drawing room here is something that every historian of Victorian domestic life eventually arrives at, and that the household management literature is remarkably anxious about without ever being quite direct. The servants knew everything, not metaphorically, literally. The people who moved through the rooms of your house, who cleaned your desk and your bedside table and your wardrobe, who answered your correspondence bell and showed in your visitors and cleared away your breakfast things. Those people had, in the ordinary exercise of their duties, access to the complete documentary, material, and intimate record of your life. They knew who called on you and how often. They could see the stack of bills in the study, and they had some understanding of whether the household was comfortable or pressed. They knew what medicines were kept in the bedroom, which told them something about what was wrong with whom. They knew, if they had been in the household long enough, the rhythms of the relationship between husband and wife, the state of the children, the specific content of the arguments that sometimes erupted in rooms that were not quite as private as the family imagined. They knew this in the way that a person knows things they have absorbed through daily proximity, not through deliberate investigation. Most of them were not spying. They simply could not avoid knowing, because knowing was unavoidable for someone who was always there, and they talked. The servants' hall as information exchange. The servants' hall in a great house was where the downstairs staff ate their meals, spent their limited leisure time, and communicated with each other in the social register below stairs. It was the private space of the servant class, below the family's level, outside the family's hearing, the place where the performance of deference was dropped and replaced with something more human. In the servants' hall, the information flowed. Not all of it was gossip in the pejorative sense. Much of it was practical. The butler telling the footman what was required for the evening's dinner party, the housekeeper giving instructions to the housemaids about the guest rooms. The practical information exchange was the overt purpose of the space, but underneath the practical exchange ran a constant current of something else. The cook's assessment of Mrs. Harding's temper, based on what she had heard coming from the morning room. The housemaid's observation that the master had received a letter that seemed to disturb him considerably, inferred from the way he had crumpled the envelope, and the fact that he had spent the rest of the morning in his study instead of going to the office. The lady's maid's knowledge, never stated explicitly, because some things were understood to stay within the upper servants, about the state of the mistress's health. The servants' hall was an intelligence operation, not a coordinated one, not one with any formal structure or purpose beyond the normal human need to share information about the environment you live in. But its outputs were genuine intelligence about the most private aspects of the employer's household, and the management of that intelligence was the management of real power. The neighborhood network beyond the walls of the individual household, the servant network extended through the neighborhood. Park meetings, the few occasions when servants from neighboring houses were all in the same place at roughly the same time, the park on a Sunday afternoon, the market on a weekday morning, the church on Sunday, were opportunities for the exchange of information that crossed household boundaries. This network was informal and decentralized and extremely effective. The information that traveled through it included which employers paid well, which paid badly, which households had good food for the servants and which ran a poor servants' table, which mistresses were kind and which were capricious, which households were currently in financial difficulty, observable from which bills were paid promptly and which were not, information that the tradespeople shared with whoever seemed interested, which family had a secret that the family imagined was well kept. For the servant class, this network was a career management tool of genuine value. The servant who knew that the family in the next street was looking for a cook, and that they paid fair wages and kept a good table, had a piece of information worth having. The servant who knew that the household 2 doors down had recently dismissed their parlor maid under circumstances that the neighborhood's collective judgment found unjust, was in a position to share that information with any domestic worker considering applying there. For the employer class, this network was a source of considerable anxiety. The Victorian household management literature returns repeatedly to the subject of servant gossip, and the anxiety in its tone is unmistakable. The servant who gossiped about the family's affairs was a breach of household security, a leakage of private information into the semi-public domain of the servant network, and the employer who suspected this was happening, which was most employers, most of the time, because it was happening most of the time, was in the uncomfortable position of being unable to do very much about it. The servant had not, by speaking to her friend in the park about the state of the household's finances, committed any legal offense. She had not stolen anything. She had not broken anything. She had simply spoken, as human beings speak to each other, about the things she knew. And the things she knew were things you very much wished she didn't. The specific uses of knowledge, beyond the general information economy of the servant network, there were specific and documented cases of servants using what they knew in ways that translated that knowledge into direct power or direct protection. The most common of these was the testimonial use. A servant who was threatened with a bad character, who had been told, explicitly or implicitly, that her reference would not be complimentary if she caused trouble, sometimes found it useful to remind her employer, gently, that what she knew about the household's affairs was not inconsiderable. This was not, generally, expressed as a direct threat. It did not need to be. A quiet conversation in which the servant mentioned something she had noticed, something that the employer had assumed she had not noticed, was enough to communicate the message. I know things. I have been discreet. I would continue to be discreet, given reasons to be. This was blackmail in its mildest form, and in the Victorian household it was so ambient as to be practically structural. The employer who treated a long-serving and knowledgeable servant badly had more to risk than just losing a competent employee. She risked the version of her private life that the servant carried in her head. Most Victorian employers understood this. Most of them did not need the reminder to be explicit. The management of the servant relationship included, always, the management of this risk, and the management of this risk was one of the reasons why the outright mistreatment of servants was less common than the structural conditions might have predicted. Hannah Cullwick and the question of documentation. We should stop here and talk about Hannah Cullwick more carefully, because she is one of the very few Victorian servants whose inner life is directly accessible to us, and what she reveals is both specific to her unusual situation and illustrative of something much broader. Hannah Cullwick was born in Shropshire in 1833, the daughter of a saddler. She began domestic service at 8 years old, working first as a nurse child to a neighboring family. By her 20s, she was a maid of all work in London, taking positions that required her to do the work of 3 servants on her own in households that could not afford more than one. In 1854, she met Arthur Munby, a barrister, a poet, and a man with an intense and frankly peculiar interest in working women, whom he documented obsessively through diary entries, poetry, and later photographs. The nature of his interest in Hannah and the nature of their relationship has generated a substantial body of academic commentary that ranges from deeply problematic by any standard to deeply problematic in ways that are more complicated than they first appear. Their relationship was, for whatever it is worth, lifelong. They married in secret in 1873, though they almost never lived together openly, and she continued to work in domestic service. Munby asked Hannah to keep a diary. She kept it, in a handwriting that she worked to improve over years of practice, recording in extraordinary practical detail what her days contained. She also, at Munby's request, wrote accounts of her feelings, her observations, her experience of her position in the world. These documents, now in the archive at Trinity College, Cambridge, are among the most detailed first-person accounts of Victorian working-class domestic life that exist. What they show is a woman of great intelligence and great self-awareness who had developed, over decades of domestic service, an extraordinarily sophisticated understanding of the social world she moved through. She understood the meaning of the invisibility requirement and had complex, layered feelings about it, sometimes grateful for the freedom it afforded, sometimes acutely aware of its cost. She understood the economics of her position precisely, what she earned, what it was worth, what alternatives existed. She also, in passages that are quieter than the rest and require careful reading, records moments that can only be described as deliberate self-assertion within the constraints of her position. A task done in her own way rather than the prescribed way, a moment of rest taken when the household logic said there should be no rest, a conversation with a neighbor that went longer than the errand required, small things, not sabotage, not theft, not anything confrontational, just the quiet reclamation of the space of her own existence in the hours and in the ways that were available to her. The diaries are heartbreaking if you read them one way and quietly triumphant if you read them another, and both readings are correct. The lady's maid problem. The lady's maid occupied a uniquely uncomfortable position in the household knowledge economy because her knowledge was more intimate than anyone else's, and her social position was more ambiguous than anyone else's. The lady's maid was not below stairs in the sense that the kitchen maid was. She was upstairs in her mistress's bedroom and dressing room, among the family's most private spaces. She knew her mistress's body, her clothing, her beauty arrangements, her letters, her medical requirements. She accompanied her when she traveled. She was present at the moments when her mistress was most herself, unmade and unguarded, before the day's social performance had been assembled. This intimacy could produce genuine affection and genuine trust in both directions. Many ladies' maids were genuinely close to their mistresses in ways that exceeded what the formal employment relationship would predict. But it also produced the specific anxiety of knowing that someone knew you this well. The mistress who understood what her lady's maid knew had every reason to manage that relationship with particular care. And the lady's maid who understood what she knew had, if she chose to use it, a particular kind of power. The cases in which ladies' maids were alleged to have sold information about their employers to newspapers, to rivals, to interested parties of various kinds, are documented in the Victorian period. They are not common, but they are not absent, and their rarity does not fully explain the depth of the employer anxiety about them, which suggests that the anxiety was not primarily about documented cases, but about the potential that the intimacy created. The lady's maid was, in structural terms, the most powerful servant in any household. Her power derived entirely from what she knew, and what she knew was everything. The poison cabinet when the resistance turned lethal before we go into the dark, a pause. The history we have been telling so far is the history of the everyday, the slow work, the broken thing, the missing candle, the gossip in the park. The history of 1.5 million people making the best they could of an arrangement that was structurally unfair and finding, within those constraints, the room to breathe that the constraints officially did not allow. This chapter is different. This chapter is about the cases where the resentment did not express itself as breakage or bad dinners or deliberate misunderstanding. The cases where it expressed itself as violence, as poison, as the irreversible act. These cases are not representative. They are exceptional by definition, and I want to be honest about that before we proceed. The Victorian servant who poisoned her employer was a figure that loomed enormously large in the middle-class imagination of the period, and that looming presence was disproportionate to the actual frequency of such events. The anxiety was real. The fear was genuine. But it was fed by a handful of sensational cases that made it into the newspapers and from there into the cultural consciousness, and it is important to keep that proportion in mind. What these cases do tell us, though, is something important about the outer edge of the resentment, about the circumstances in which the ordinary weapons of the weak were not enough, or were not available, or were not chosen. About what happens when someone with very little power and very little recourse decides that she is finished with the small things. Let's begin. Arsenic. The context any discussion of Victorian poisoning eventually arrives at arsenic, and discussions of Victorian servant poisoning arrive there faster than most. Arsenic trioxide, the white powder that was the primary form of arsenic used in Victorian England, was legal to purchase and widely available in the mid-Victorian period. It was sold by chemists and ironmongers. It was used as a rat poison, as a weed killer, in the preparation of animal hides, in the manufacture of certain pigments, and alarmingly, as a beauty treatment. There was a genuine Victorian tradition of taking small amounts of arsenic to improve the complexion, which should tell you something about the risk tolerance of the 19th century. The Arsenic Act of 1851 introduced regulations requiring arsenic to be mixed with soot or indigo to make it visually distinct, and requiring buyers to provide their name and address in a register. This slowed the market. It did not close it. In rural areas, the regulations were enforced sporadically. In urban areas, chemists were not always rigorous about the register. Arsenic had several properties that made it particularly attractive as a poison for someone in the servant's specific situation. It was tasteless and odorless. It was slow-acting. A small dose caused symptoms resembling gastroenteritis or cholera, depending on the decade and the current state of epidemic disease in the area, which meant it could be difficult to distinguish from natural illness. It was available. And critically, it could be administered in food or drink, which gave the person in charge of the household's food and drink a specific and terrible opportunity. The cook, the kitchen maid, the person who made the tea. The opportunity was obvious. Most people did not take it, but some people did. The Mary Ann Cotton problem. Mary Ann Cotton was born in 1832 in County Durham, and she is the most extensively documented Victorian serial poisoner with a background in domestic service, which makes her a useful case study and also a deeply uncomfortable one. She worked briefly in domestic service before her first marriage, though her career in service was neither long nor particularly distinguished. What distinguished her career once it began in earnest was the death rate among people in her immediate vicinity. She had 4 husbands, at least 3 of them died. She had 13 children, at least 11 of them died. She lived with or was close to a number of other people who also died. The total number of deaths plausibly attributable to Mary Ann Cotton is estimated at between 15 and 21, making her likely the most prolific serial killer in Victorian England, though several of her cases were retrospective attributions and not subject to contemporary prosecution. In 1872, she was investigated in connection with the death of her stepson Charles Edward Cotton, a 7-year-old boy who had been a financial inconvenience to her planned remarriage. The death prompted a local coroner named Thomas Riley, who had encountered Cotton in a suspicious context shortly before the boy died, to insist on an investigation. Arsenic was found. Mary Ann Cotton was tried, convicted, and hanged in March 1873. The case matters for our purposes not primarily because she was a domestic worker. She was not, in her murderous phase, working for anyone but herself, but because the mechanism she used and the context she operated in drew on the specific domestic knowledge and domestic access that women of her class and background possessed. She poisoned people through the food and household arrangements she controlled. She was believed by those who knew her because she was the person who was supposed to be caring for the sick members of her household. The trust that domestic care generates was the exact instrument she exploited. She had learned how households worked, and then she worked a household in the worst way possible. The Cotton case generated enormous newspaper coverage and enormous public commentary, and one of the things that commentary returned to again and again was the proximity of the domestic caretaker to the most vulnerable members of the household, the sick, the elderly, the very young, the person who made the soup, the person who administered the medicine, the person who was trusted structurally and completely to care for those who could not care for themselves. The trust was real. The exploitation of that trust in the hands of Mary Ann Cotton was monstrous. But the trust itself, the trust in the person who made the soup, was a truth that every Victorian household lived with, whether or not they thought about it clearly. The domestic poisoning record, the Old Bailey records, and the provincial assizes records of the Victorian period contain a number of cases in which servants were prosecuted for poisoning employers, co-workers, or members of employers' families. Historians of Victorian crime, including Martin Weiner and Judith Flanders, have analyzed these records carefully. and what they show is nuanced. The absolute numbers are small. In any given decade, the number of servants convicted of poisoning their employers or household members was in the single digits across England and Wales. This is, in a workforce of 1.5 million, a vanishingly small proportion. But the pattern within those small numbers is interesting. The cases that reached prosecution were overwhelmingly cases involving arsenic, and they were overwhelmingly cases in which the relationship between the servant and the victim had been notably poor. Poor in documented, sometimes publicly known ways: disputes over wages, complaints about working conditions, arguments about dismissal or character, the specific grievances that push the everyday resentment into a different register. These were not random acts. They were the end point of a process. They were what happened when the slow work and the broken thing and the deliberate misunderstanding were not available or had not been sufficient, and the person with the grievance had a kitchen and an arsenic supply and had decided that she had had enough. To be extremely clear, this was murder. This was the legal and moral wrong of killing a person, and nothing in the circumstances of the servant class makes it otherwise. The purpose of understanding the context is not to excuse the act. It is to understand why the act was committed, what it says about the conditions that produced it, and why those conditions existed. The case of Christina Wilson, 1873. In the spring of 1873, a cook named Christina Wilson was employed in the household of a solicitor named Arthur Baxter in Leeds. The relationship between Wilson and the Baxter household had deteriorated over a period of several months. Mrs. Baxter had complained repeatedly about the quality of the cooking. Wilson had, by her own later account, experienced these complaints as unfair, given the quality of the provisions she was allocated and the limitations of the kitchen equipment. She had been told in February that she would not be given a character. In April, Mr. Baxter became seriously ill with symptoms that his physician initially attributed to gastroenteritis. He recovered. In May, he became ill again. This time the physician was less comfortable with his diagnosis and consulted a colleague. The colleague ordered a chemical analysis of the patient's urine. Arsenic was found. The investigation quickly fixed on Christina Wilson. Arsenic was found in the kitchen, a quantity that she explained, not unreasonably, by reference to its use as a rat poison, and in the stock of tea that had been brewed for Mr. Baxter during his illness. Wilson was prosecuted for administering poison with intent to murder. The trial was a significant local event. The evidence was circumstantial. There was no witness to the administration of the arsenic, and Wilson denied all of it with complete consistency. The jury was out for several hours before returning a verdict of guilty. She was sentenced to death, later commuted to penal servitude for life. The case was reported in the Leeds papers and picked up briefly by the national press, adding one more data point to the middle-class anxiety about the domestic proximity of the servant. What was almost entirely absent from the newspaper coverage, and what the trial proceedings barely addressed, were the conditions that had preceded the poisoning, the months of conflict, the withheld character, the specific grievances about inadequate resources for the work demanded. These were mentioned briefly in the defense's address. They did not significantly alter the outcome. The context was noted. It was not accepted as mitigation. The undiscovered cases here, we have to be careful but honest. The cases that reached prosecution represent only those cases that were discovered. The Victorian medical profession's ability to detect arsenic poisoning improved considerably after James Marsh's development of the Marsh test in 1836, but before the widespread adoption of that test in coroners' investigations, which took decades and was inconsistent across different jurisdictions. A death by arsenic that presented as gastroenteritis or cholera would very often not be investigated further. Historians of Victorian crime have argued, with some force, that the number of arsenic poisonings in Victorian England that were recorded as natural deaths and never investigated is unknowable but likely substantial. The domestic context in which most of these deaths occurred, household members caring for sick relatives, servants preparing food for weakened patients, provided both opportunity and cover. This is not an argument that the Victorian household was a death trap. It is an argument that the forensic picture we have is incomplete, and that the incompleteness skews toward undercount rather than overcount. What this means for the history of servant resistance is, we cannot know how many cases there were. We know the cases that were discovered and prosecuted. We know that the discovered cases share features: the prior conflict, the withheld character, the specific grievance, that suggest they were not random. We know that the conditions that produced the discovered cases existed widely. We do not know, and cannot know, how often those conditions produced the same outcome, and the outcome was never investigated. Arsenic in the tea, a Victorian anxiety by the 1860s and 1870s, the anxiety about arsenic in the tea had become something of a cultural touchstone. It appeared in Punch cartoons. It appeared in sensation novels, Wilkie Collins's The Woman in White, 1859, and Mary Elizabeth Braddon's Lady Audley's Secret, 1862, both feature poison in domestic contexts, and both sold in enormous quantities to a readership that was evidently finding the subject viscerally interesting. It appeared in household management discussions as a serious concern, with Mrs. Beeton and her contemporaries advising that medicines and cleaning materials containing arsenic should be kept strictly separate from food stores. The anxiety was, as we have noted, disproportionate to the actual frequency of servant poisoning, but it was not irrational. It was the correct intuition about a genuine structural vulnerability, expressed at a scale that the documented evidence didn't quite support. The household needed to eat, the servant prepared the food, the employer could not watch the preparation of every meal, the medicine cabinet contained arsenic, the cleaning supplies sometimes contained arsenic, the rat poison definitely contained arsenic, the vulnerability was real, even when the probability was low, and the anxiety it generated had effects. It affected how employers interacted with their servants. It affected the social text around the kitchen and the food preparation and the management of household chemicals. It was a constant background noise in the Victorian domestic soundtrack, just below the level at which anyone was willing to speak of it directly. It was the shadow that the servant cast, invisibly, on the drawing room. Fire and fury, the ultimate weapon, and the people who used it there is, in the hierarchy of servant resistance, one act that stands above the rest in terms of irreversibility, visibility, and consequence. Arson, the setting of fire to the employer's house or property or both. It happened, not often, not routinely, but the documented cases of servant arson in Victorian England are real and they are specific, and they follow a pattern that is, once you see it, very difficult to ignore. The pattern, let us establish the pattern before we look at the cases. The servant arson case in Victorian England follows, with remarkable consistency, a particular sequence of events. First, a dispute, a specific, documented, often witnessed dispute between the servant and the employer. A dispute about wages, about the character, about dismissal, about working conditions, about some specific grievance that the servant has raised and the employer has not resolved. Second, an escalation. The dispute has not resolved. The servant has given notice or been given notice or threatened one or the other. The period between the dispute and the fire is typically short days or weeks. Third, the fire. The fire that in almost every case is set at night when the house is occupied. This is not in most cases a fire designed to kill. It is set in an outbuilding, a storeroom, a lower room where it can be discovered. It is a fire intended to damage, to fright, to make its point. It is the destruction of property as statement. Fourth, the investigation. Arson is difficult to prove and Victorian fire investigation was limited. The cases that reached prosecution are those in which the evidence was sufficiently direct. The servant was seen near the fire. Accelerant was found in the servant's possession. A witness could testify to what they had heard or seen. Many cases that were suspected arson were never prosecuted because the evidence did not exist or could not be obtained. Sarah Drake, 1857. Sarah Drake was a housemaid employed by a family named Whitley in a house near Bristol in 1856. She was 19. She had been with the Whitleys for approximately 8 months when a dispute arose about her wages. The specific content of the dispute is not clear from the surviving records, but it resulted in Mrs. Whitley threatening to dismiss Drake without a character on the grounds of some unspecified dereliction. In January 1857, a fire broke out in the Whitley house at approximately 2 in the morning. The family was roused and escaped. The damage was significant. A room and half the contents of an adjoining storage area were destroyed, but the house itself survived. An investigation found that the fire appeared to have been set deliberately in a ground floor room near the back of the house. Drake was arrested when a neighbor came forward to say they had seen her near the back of the Whitley house at approximately the relevant time. She denied setting the fire with a consistency that the Bristol magistrate found unconvincing. She was convicted of arson and sentenced to penal servitude. The Bristol Mercury covered the case in moderate detail, and the commentary in the paper was notably less sympathetic to the accused than some later accounts of similar cases would be. Drake was described as designing, and her youth was noted not as a mitigating factor, but as evidence of early criminality, which tells you something about how the Bristol Mercury felt about its readers' anxieties. The widespread practice that wasn't reported, the documented cases of servant arson, are, inevitably, only the cases that were prosecuted. Fire investigation in Victorian England was limited, and the practice of attributing convenient fires to accident or overheated flue was standard enough that many cases of suspected servant arson simply never reached a courtroom. The insurance records of Victorian England, where they survive, show rates of fire in domestic settings that are difficult to fully explain by the available technologies and the condition of Victorian buildings. The open fire, the candle, the gas lamp, these were genuine fire hazards, and many Victorian house fires were entirely accidental. But the distribution of fires and the timing and the circumstances in which they occurred has led some historians to suggest that a non-trivial proportion of Victorian domestic fires that were attributed to accident were in fact set deliberately by people who had reason to want them to happen. This cannot be proven. What can be said is that the category of deliberate domestic fire by aggrieved servants, while extreme, was not confined to a handful of isolated cases, but was a recognized enough phenomenon to generate a specific genre of anxiety in the household management literature and in the Victorian press. The vocabulary of extremity, why fire? Of all the weapons available to the aggrieved servant, the fire is the most spectacular, the most dangerous, the most irreversible, and the most legible. It cannot be attributed to accident with conviction once it has been investigated. It cannot be dismissed as incompetence or misunderstanding. It announces itself. The servant who set a fire was not hiding. She was, in the terms of James Scott's analysis, abandoning the weapons of the weak for the weapons of the desperate. She was moving from deniability to declaration. She was saying in the most unambiguous possible terms that the ordinary channels, the slow work, the broken thing, the information withheld, had either not been available to her or had not been sufficient. She was also, in most cases, sacrificing herself. The domestic servant who set fire to her employer's house was almost certain to face criminal prosecution, and conviction for arson was a serious felony. Transportation in the earlier Victorian period, penal servitude in the later. The sentence was not light, and yet the cases exist. The servants who committed arson knew the likely consequences. They did it anyway. This should tell you something about the level of desperation involved, and the level of resentment behind that desperation, and the degree to which the ordinary mechanisms of complaint and redress had failed them. The fire was the last word in a conversation that had not otherwise been allowed to happen. The servant problem, in print how the employing class wrote about what terrified them. You are now going to hear a great deal about the servant problem, and you are going to hear it in the language of the people who identified it as a problem. This is an important section, because the way the employer class wrote about the servant class is itself historical data. Not data about servants, the employers were not reliable witnesses to the inner lives of the people who worked for them, but data about the employers, about their anxieties, their assumptions, their self-image, and the specific forms that their relationship to their own discomfort took. The servant problem was a term that entered common Victorian usage sometime in the 1850s and never left, appearing in periodicals, newspapers, household management guides, parliamentary discussions, and the private correspondence of every kind of middle-class woman who employed domestic help until the early 20th century. It was still being called the servant problem in 1914, which is when the circumstances changed enough that a new vocabulary was required. What did they mean by it? The official definition at its most surface level, the servant problem, referred to the difficulty of finding and keeping good domestic servants, servants who were honest, competent, reliable, hardworking, properly deferential, and possessed of the moral character consistent with being admitted to the family home. The complaint was that such servants were becoming increasingly difficult to find. The supply was inadequate. The quality was declining. Girls who might previously have gone into domestic service were now taking factory positions or shop positions or even clerical positions, and the domestic servant market was accordingly receiving a pool of candidates that was, according to the people making this argument, less suitable, less skilled, less appropriately humble, and more demanding than had previously been the case. This complaint was made with essentially identical content across the entire Victorian period, from the 1840s to the 1900s. The language is almost interchangeable across decades. It was made with the same urgency in 1845 and in 1895 and neither decade produced any evidence that the supply had materially worsened or that domestic servants had become meaningfully less competent. What had changed over this period was the expectations and social position of domestic servants. They were gradually slightly less willing to accept the terms of the 1850s in the 1890s. They were slightly more mobile, more likely to have alternative options, more likely to insist on reasonable terms, marginally more likely to give notice over treatment they found unacceptable. The change was slow, and the power differential remained enormous, but it was real. And the people writing about the servant problem felt it as a crisis. Mrs. Beeton's Army Isabella Beeton's book of household management opens with the famous comparison of the household mistress to the commander of an army. It is worth reading in full, or as close to full as our copyright obligations allow. The image is entirely military. The mistress surveys her domestic forces. She allocates tasks, manages personnel, maintains discipline, ensures supply. The household is a system under her command. The servants are the troops. The military metaphor is revealing for several reasons, the most interesting of which is what it does to the question of obedience. In an army, the soldier obeys, not because she is a full person with full moral agency who has freely consented to each individual order, because the structure requires it, because the chain of command is the principle by which the operation functions. Because a soldier who exercises independent moral judgment about each individual order is not a soldier in any functional sense. Mrs. Beeton's model servant is, in this military framework, the obedient soldier. Her full human subjectivity, her opinions, her preferences, her independent judgment is not an asset in this model. It is a potential problem. The general does not want soldiers who think independently. The household mistress does not want servants who have ideas of their own. This is the ideology that the quiet rebellion was fighting against, not with weapons, not with organization, with the mundane, daily insistence on being a person who thought and felt and occasionally did what she chose when no one was watching. Punch and the Servant Girl Punch magazine, which defined the comedic sensibility of the Victorian middle class for the better part of a century, ran a continuous series of pieces about domestic servants that constitute the most extensive popular documentation of employer anxiety in the period. The Punch servant is a specific type. She is Irish, or she is from the countryside. She is cheerfully incompetent in a way that is presented as both amusing and slightly sinister. She breaks things. She misunderstands instructions. She talks back, gently and with an innocent expression that suggests she does not understand that she is talking back. She has opinions, expressed in a register that makes them technically deniable as opinions rather than direct assertions. She is charming and infuriating in equal measure. The Punch servant is, in other words, the weapons of the weak made into a character type. The slow work, the deliberate misunderstanding, the maintained ignorance, all of these have been aestheticized into a figure who is comic rather than threatening, who amuses rather than frightens. This is interesting, because the comic treatment of the servants' small rebellions was a way of managing the anxiety they produced, a way of saying, yes, this happens, and it is amusing rather than alarming. The joke was the mechanism by which the employer class processed something that was, if you looked at it squarely, a genuine insubordination built into the structure of the relationship. If you laughed at the Punch servant, you didn't have to think too carefully about why she behaved as she did. The laugh was the thing that made it harmless. The domestic management literature's prescription, the household management literature of the Victorian period, in its advice about servants, oscillates between two somewhat contradictory positions. The first position is that the servant should be treated with kindness, consideration, and genuine humanity, that a well-treated servant is a better servant, that the mistress who provides good food and comfortable accommodation and fair wages will be rewarded with loyalty and diligence. This is the progressive position, and it is represented not just by later Victorians, but by Beaton herself, who has a chapter specifically on the importance of the mistress treating her servants well. The second position is that the servant must be managed firmly, that softness breeds familiarity and familiarity breeds contempt, that the line between mistress and servant must be maintained clearly for the household to function, and that the servant who is given an inch will take a mile. This is the authoritarian position. What is striking is how often both positions appear in the same text, sometimes in adjacent chapters. The management literature cannot quite decide whether the servant is a human being deserving of consideration or a resource requiring careful control, because the answer is both, and the two truths in practice create a tension that cannot be fully resolved. Parliamentary anxiety, the servant problem, eventually generated enough middle-class alarm to reach Parliament, in the form of occasional debates about the regulation of domestic service, the character reference system, and the rights, or lack thereof, of domestic workers. These debates are revealing not so much for what they resolved, which was very little, as for what they reveal about the assumptions of the debaters. The servant question in Parliament was framed almost exclusively from the employer's perspective. The question of how to ensure better quality servants, how to regulate the character system to prevent abuses by servants who obtained fraudulent references, how to improve the supply of domestic labor, how to ensure that girls from the workhouses and the country were prepared for domestic service. These were the dominant framings. The question of what the servants themselves thought was almost entirely absent from the parliamentary record. When it did appear, it appeared briefly and usually in the context of charity or benevolence. The domestic servant was a person who needed protection, moral guidance, access to savings institutions, a benevolent society to provide aid in case of illness or old age. She needed these things because her position was recognized, at least in this context, as one of genuine vulnerability. But she was not asked. Her voice does not appear in Hansard, the most extensive documentary record of the servant class's own views on their situation was not generated by Parliament or by the philanthropic societies or by the household management literature. It was generated, haltingly and partially and at great effort, by the servants themselves. The ONES who wrote back servant testimony, hidden literature, and the voice from below stairs, I want to ask you to hold something in your mind as you listen to this chapter. We have spent the last several chapters discussing what the servant class did, the ways they resisted, the ways they fought back, the strategies they used to maintain some portion of their own humanity within a system designed to commodify it. We have talked about this largely from the outside, from employer complaints, from court records, from the cultural anxiety visible in the management literature. Now I want to talk about it from the inside. The problem is that the inside voice is scarce. This is not an accident. A Victorian working-class woman who spent 12 to 16 hours per day in paid labor had very little time for writing. She often had limited formal education, compulsory schooling only became available with the 1870 Education Act, and its implementation was uneven. She had no publishing industry interested in her voice. She had no readership, or thought she didn't, and she was told daily in the structure of the household she worked in that her interiority was not the relevant thing, that what she did was what mattered, not what she thought. The servants who left written records are therefore exceptional. They wrote against the grain of their situation. They wrote because someone asked them to, as Hannah Cullwick did, or because they could not help it, or because they had reached a point in their lives where they could. What they wrote is extraordinary. Hannah Cullwick, the full record. We have already met Hannah Cullwick. But now let us stay with her longer, because her diaries are the most detailed, most honest, most fully realized portrait of Victorian domestic experience that we have, and they deserve more than a passing mention. Hannah began keeping her diary in the mid-1850s. The diaries she kept are in two categories: the detailed daily records of work performed, which read like a kind of inventory of labor, a deliberate accounting of everything she did on each day, and the more reflective passages, which read like something else entirely. On the daily records first, an entry from 1860, she had risen at 6. She had cleaned the range, set the fires, cleaned the boots of the 3 male members of the household, hauled coal twice, scrubbed the hall floor, made the beds, swept and dusted the upstairs rooms, prepared and served breakfast, washed up the breakfast things, black-leaded the kitchen range, scrubbed the kitchen floor, prepared the dinner, served dinner, cleared and washed up, and then done the mending until she was allowed to stop. This is a normal day. What she records without complaint, without drama, with a flatness of tone that is its own kind of eloquence, is the simple physical fact of what this life required. It required everything. It required her body and her time and her attention from before dawn to after dark. It left in the hours that remained almost nothing for the interior life that everyone, regardless of their position, has some claim to. And yet the interior life was there. Because Munby asked her about it, and because she found, in the act of writing it, something she had not expected, a sense that the thoughts were real, that they counted, that the fact of writing them down gave them a solidity that the invisible life of the maid of all work did not otherwise possess. The more reflective passages in the diaries are remarkable. She writes about what she sees, the family she works for, their habits, their occasional kindness, their unreliable attention to whether she has eaten or rested. She writes about the gap between how she is treated and how she thinks of herself, not with bitterness, not with self-pity, but with a kind of stubborn, quiet insistence on her own inner reality. She writes about what she feels about her work, and here is the complexity that makes the diaries unlike any simple narrative of oppression. She had genuine pride in the work, pride that was real and earned. She could black-lead a range to a shine that satisfied her. She could do in a day what most maids would struggle to accomplish in a day and a half. Her pride was not the pride of someone who has been conditioned to love her chains. It was the pride of competence, of expertise, of mastery of a difficult skill. She could be a person who had genuine pride in her work and also a person who was treated poorly, in a system that was unfair, that asked more of her than it had any right to ask. Both things were true. She seems to have understood this, in her own terms, without needing to have read any of the political philosophy that might have provided a vocabulary for it. Margaret Powell's. The 20th century voice looking back, Margaret Powell was not strictly a Victorian servant. She was born in 1907 and worked in domestic service in the 1920s and 1930s, but her memoir Below Stairs, published in 1968 and subsequently made into the television series that partially inspired Upstairs, Downstairs, draws on a tradition and a system of domestic service that was still recognizably Victorian in its structure and its assumptions. Her voice is different from Hannah Cullwick's. It is funny, sharp, occasionally angry, and possessed of a retrospective clarity that comes from writing decades after the events described. But what she says about the experience of domestic service connects directly to everything we have been discussing. She describes the no-followers rule with a precision that makes it newly concrete. The boyfriend who had to be met outside the house on her one evening off per week, who could never come inside, who was a part of her life that had to be entirely severed from the life of the household. The two lives, the life you presented to your employer and the life you actually lived, were kept separate always, and the effort of maintaining that separation was itself a labor on top of all the other labors. She describes the food, what the family ate, what the servants ate, the specific quality of the distinction. The smell of the good food going upstairs, the thinner version going downstairs. She describes the character system, the specific vulnerability it created, the knowledge that one displeased employer could derail a career she had built through years of work. And she describes the resistance, not the dramatic versions, but the daily, woven-in, entirely recognizable versions. The dinner prepared with less care than she was capable of, in a kitchen where the employer had been particularly unjust that morning. The silver polished to adequacy rather than perfection for reasons she chose not to examine too closely. The small reclamations of time and energy that were, cumulatively, the only wages the system had not managed to extract. The letters that survive beyond the formal memoirs and diaries. There is a scattered record in letters written by servants to family members, to former employers, to organizations that provided assistance to domestic workers. These letters survive in archives, in the records of the servants' benevolent institution, in family papers, in the records of women's advocacy organizations that began to take an interest in domestic workers from the 1880s onward. The letters are short, as a rule. Literacy was limited, and writing was a skill that required time and materials that servants did not always have. But the letters that exist are explicit about specific grievances in ways that public testimony rarely was. A letter from 1882 in the archives of a domestic workers' charity from a woman who signs herself only M.E. She has been dismissed after 4 years in a position, without warning, without sufficient cause, with a character that she believes has been deliberately damaged. She is 51 years old. She has no savings because the household expenses of her employment consumed what she earned. She has no family to return to. She is asking for assistance, any assistance, from anyone who might be in a position to provide it. The letter is entirely practical. It is not angry. It is the letter of a person who is applying formal channels of appeal because formal channels are what remain. The anger, if it was there, and it is hard to believe it was not, was behind the practical framing. These letters are the historical record of what the weapons of the weak were aimed against, and what happened to the people who wielded those weapons when they weren't enough. The Women's Industrial Council and the 1890s surveys in the 1890s, the Women's Industrial Council, a progressive organization that investigated the working conditions of women across multiple industries, turned its attention to domestic service. The resulting reports, published between 1894 and 1898, are among the most valuable documents we have of servant experience from the servant's own perspective. The council conducted interviews. It asked servants directly about their conditions, their wages, their hours, their treatment, their sense of what was fair and what was not. The result was a body of testimony that was more systematic and more extensive than anything previously gathered. What the testimony revealed was not surprising, given everything we have discussed, but it was explicit in ways that previous records were not. The hours were the most consistent complaint. 14 to 16 hours per day, confirmed across multiple respondents in multiple types of household. The no followers rule was the next most common, not opposition to the rule in principle, in several cases, but opposition to its inflexibility, to the complete severing of social life it required. The character system came third, the vulnerability it created, the specific fear of the false or withheld character, the way it foreclosed complaint. And then there were the smaller things, the food again, the rooms, the way time off was given and then taken back at short notice when the household suddenly needed something, the way the uniform had to be purchased at the servant's expense. The way the employer sometimes addressed the servant in front of guests in a tone that was humiliating rather than simply formal. The council's reports were published. They were read by the people who read progressive publications about working-class conditions. They were not widely read by the people who employed domestic servants. They did not change the law, which would not change in any meaningful way until after the First World War. But they are there. The voices are there. They told the truth. The servant problem becomes the servant crisis, the long slide, and what accelerated it by 1900, something was shifting. It was not a revolution. It was not a sudden collapse. The domestic service industry in 1900 was still enormous, still employing more than 1.5 million people, still the largest single employment category for women in England and Wales. But the edges of the thing were beginning to fray in ways that the people who employed servants could feel even when they could not quite articulate what was changing. The girls were less willing. That is the phrase that appears in employer accounts of the early 20th century. The girls were less willing than they had been. Less willing to accept certain positions, less willing to take the terms that had been standard for decades. More likely to ask before accepting a position about the specific hours, the specific days off, the specific terms of the character reference if they chose to leave. More likely, in short, to negotiate not dramatically, not from a position of strength, but with a slightly more clearly articulated sense that the relationship had two parties, both of whose interests were relevant. Where did this come from? The alternative economy, the most important driver of the shift, was the existence, by the 1890s and 1900s, of a genuine alternative economy for working-class women. The factory system had been absorbing female labor since the Industrial Revolution, and by the late Victorian period, it was offering wages, conditions, and freedoms that compared favorably to domestic service in several important respects. Factory work was paid at a weekly wage that was in many cases higher than domestic service, even accounting for the absence of room and board. Factory work ended at a specific time every day and the worker went home. Factory work was subject to legal regulation of hours and conditions that domestic service explicitly was not. Factory work allowed you to have a boyfriend, a social life, an existence outside the working environment. Shop work employment in the expanding retail sector offered similar advantages, with the additional benefit of being considered slightly more genteel than factory work, which mattered to women who were navigating the fine gradations of late Victorian working-class respectability. Clerical work, which expanded dramatically from the 1880s onward as typewriting became a standard office technology, and as the expanding commercial economy required more clerks, accountants, bookkeepers, and office administrators, was beginning to be accessible to women with adequate literacy and numeracy. Clerical work was respectably indoor and required presentable clothing, and offered a degree of social status that was legible in specific ways. It was, in many respects, the most desirable alternative to domestic service for the young woman of limited means but educated aspiration. By 1900, these alternatives were real and available, and the domestic service market was beginning to feel their effect. Not catastrophically, not yet, but detectably. The servant was becoming slightly harder to find and slightly more expensive to keep. The Board of Trade Investigation, 1899. In 1899, the Board of Trade conducted an investigation into domestic service as part of a broader survey of working conditions for women in Britain. The investigation was prompted partly by the complaints of middle-class employers about the declining supply and quality of domestic servants, and partly by the advocacy of progressive organizations that had been pressing for attention to the working conditions of domestic workers. The investigation found, among other things, that domestic servants worked longer hours than workers in any regulated industry, that domestic servants had no legal entitlement to any specified time off, that the character reference system created conditions of dependency that the investigators found difficult to characterize as consistent with the free labor market that British economic law claimed to be operating. The investigation recommended certain reforms. The reforms were not enacted. The legislative environment for domestic service reform was bleak, and the political class that might have enacted reforms was, for the most part, the employing class. But the investigation was documented, the testimony was taken, the record exists. The Edwardian decade, the problem intensifies in the first decade of the 20th century, the servant problem became louder. The middle-class periodicals that had been running servant complaint pieces since the 1840s were running them with a new urgency. The alternative occupations that were attracting potential domestic workers were expanding. The wages that had been standard were coming under upward pressure as employers competed in a tightening market for available workers. New technologies were entering the household that changed, slightly, the terms of domestic labor. Gas lighting reduced the demand for candle-carrying labor. The vacuum cleaner, patented in various forms from the early 1900s, began slowly to change the arithmetic of carpet cleaning. Commercially produced food products began to reduce, at the margins, the labor demands of kitchen work. These changes were slow and partial and did not transform the domestic labor market overnight, but they were real and they pointed in a direction. The domestic service industry of 1910 was recognizably the domestic service industry of 1870, but it was also slightly different, and the difference was felt by everyone in it, on both sides of the green baize door. The house empties the First World War and the end of an arrangement, August 1914. You know this date, you know what it means. You know what happened over the 4 years that followed, and you know the scale of it, and you know that the scale of it changed almost everything about the world it occurred in. What you may not know, or may not have thought about in this specific context, is what it did to the domestic service industry of England. It was the end. Not immediately, not completely, not permanently in every case. But in its structural effects, the First World War was the moment at which the Victorian servant class as it had existed since the 1840s began to be, irrevocably, a thing of the past. The numbers leave in 1914. There were approximately 1.4 million domestic servants in England and Wales. In 1918, there were fewer than 1 million. The loss was not to death, though domestic servants did serve and die in the war in numbers consistent with their share of the population. The loss was to the war economy. The war needed workers. It needed workers in munitions factories, in the expanding military supply infrastructure, in the hospitals and nursing facilities that military medicine required, in the transport networks, and the agricultural systems that the absence of male labor had disrupted. It needed women workers particularly, because the male workforce was, in very large numbers, at the front, and the women who went to do this work found, in many cases, that what they had been doing for a fraction of the wages and none of the freedoms was actually less appealing than they had previously been told. The munitions factories of the Midlands were noisy, dirty, dangerous, and physically demanding. The hours were long. The work was technical and in some cases chemically hazardous. Women who worked in TNT filling factories turned yellow from the chemical exposure. Women who handled detonators lived with the constant proximity of violent accident. And yet, the wages were better. The hours were defined. The time was your own after. You could go home at the end of the shift. You could have a boyfriend. You could go to the pictures on Saturday night. You could, in the limited but genuine sense that the phrase permits, have a life. The women who left domestic service for the wartime economy returned to it, after 1918, in smaller numbers than had left. What the employers found the employers who had depended on domestic service found, in the years immediately after the war, that the relationship had changed in ways they could not reverse by offering slightly higher wages or somewhat better terms. The women who had spent 4 years in factories or hospitals or driving ambulances or organizing supply depots had accumulated something that could not be easily taken away. The knowledge that they were capable of work that the Victorian domestic service system had never asked them to do, and that this work was more interesting, better paid, and more compatible with having an autonomous human life. Some came back to service, yes. Particularly the older women, for whom the wartime opportunities had been less available or less attractive, and for whom the familiar world of the household below stairs was genuinely preferable to the uncertainty of the post-war labor market. But the youngest generation, the women who might previously have expected to go into service at 14 or 15 and spend the core of their working lives there, largely did not come back. The domestic service industry adjusted, unevenly and often badly. The great houses began to contract their staffs. The middle-class household that had run to 2 or 3 servants found itself running to 1, or to none, or to occasional dailies, women who came in for part of the day and then went home, which was an entirely different relationship from the live-in-servant model that had characterized the Victorian period. The interwar period, a different world. The 1920s and 1930s saw domestic service decline further, but in ways that were unevenly distributed. The great houses of the aristocracy maintained significant staffs in many cases. The economics of the country house in the interwar period are an entire separate conversation, but they maintained them with a difficulty, and at a cost that was notably different from the pre-war situation. The middle-class home in the interwar period was transformed by a combination of labor scarcity, new technology, and changing social expectation. Gas and electric cookers reduced the labor requirements of the kitchen. Vacuum cleaners, commercially produced cleaning products, and the availability of ready-made clothing reduced the labor requirements of housekeeping and laundry. And the cultural expectation that a respectable household required domestic service was slowly and unevenly weakening. The women who had run households entirely through domestic labor in 1900 were by the 1930s in many cases doing their own cooking, their own cleaning, and their own shopping. Not because they preferred it necessarily, but because the alternative was no longer reliably available at the terms they had previously expected. This was, in its quiet way, a revolution. The women of the servant class had been, for a century, the invisible infrastructure of middle-class life. The house had run because they ran it. The family had eaten because they cooked. The children had been cared for because they cared for them. The social performances of the Victorian household, the dinner parties, the clean house, the polished silver, the morning fires, had been possible because an army of underpaid, overworked, legally vulnerable women had made them possible. And when those women found something better to do, the house showed its true nature. It was not a self-managing system. It was a system managed by people who had their own interests, people who had resented, quietly and persistently, and in the ways available to them, the terms of their management. When they left, the terms had to be renegotiated. The 1931 census, and what it showed, the 1931 census recorded approximately 1.3 million domestic servants in England and Wales, down from approximately 1.7 million in 1901, a decline of 23% in 3 decades. The decline was almost entirely in the live-in servant category. The daily domestic, what we might now call the cleaner or home help, was increasing as a proportion of the category. The live-in servant was disappearing. The relationship that had defined middle-class life for a century, with its elaborate hierarchy, its character references, its no-followers rules and its bells and its servant staircases, and its upstairs-downstairs spatial logic, that relationship was becoming economically and socially unsustainable. By 1939, on the eve of the Second War, the trajectory was clear. The great houses were closing or contracting. The middle-class home was increasingly managed by its occupants or by daily help that came and went on terms that bore no resemblance to the Victorian live-in servant relationship. The age of the Victorian servant was over. What the quiet ONES left behind reflection, consequence, and the long shadow pacing note, slow down here. The chapter that follows should feel like a period of quiet after a long story. Let the weight of what has been described settle before the analysis. Here is a question worth sitting with. The Victorian servant class, 1.5 million people at its height, predominantly female, predominantly young, predominantly without legal protection or organized advocacy or political voice, conducted a sustained, largely invisible, strategically sophisticated campaign of resistance against the terms of an exploitative labor relationship. They did this over a period of roughly 60 years, from the 1840s to the first decade of the 20th century. They did it without strikes, without unions, without any of the institutional mechanisms through which labor movements typically operate. And they won, not in a single decisive moment, not with a manifesto or a march or a declaration. They won gradually by the force of their collective refusal to continue supplying their labor at the terms that were offered. They won by leaving slowly, in ones and twos and then in hundreds of thousands, to the factories and the shops and the typing pools and the hospitals, and eventually the offices and the professions. They won by becoming visible enough in the war years to demonstrate that they were something the household could not manage without, and that the price of their labor had to reflect that fact. The Victorian employing class, which had spent half a century complaining about the servant problem, the supply, the quality, the cost, the ingratitude, was in its complaints accurately describing the early stages of a process it did not understand. The servant problem was not a problem of supply or quality. It was the problem of a labor relationship that was priced incorrectly and structured unjustly, and that was beginning, incrementally, to face the consequences of those facts. What the resistance actually cost, but I want to be honest about this, because the story I have been telling has a shape that is, in the telling, more satisfying than the reality was. The women who resisted, who slowed their work, broke the china, made the bad dinner, stole the candles, gossiped in the park, set the fire, poured the arsenic, most of them are not remembered. Most of them won nothing in any individual sense. The housemaid who made her employer's life slightly worse through subtle, deniable acts of quiet insubordination did not thereby improve her own conditions. She remained in the same position, earning the same wages, working the same hours. The bad dinner did not produce better terms. The broken china did not produce a raise. The resistance was not, in most cases, strategic in any calculable sense. It was not a plan. It was the expression of a human interiority that refused to be completely consumed by the role it was assigned. It was the insistence on being a person rather than a function, even when being a person produced no material benefit and carried real risks. This is not a small thing. In fact, I think it is one of the most significant things in this entire story. Because the point of the Victorian domestic service system, the point of the invisibility, the silence, the no followers rule, the bells, the character reference, the servant stares, the different menu, was precisely to deny the servant her full humanity, to convert her, in the imagination of the household, from a person into an apparatus, a self-propelled domestic machine that had the grace to maintain the fiction of its own simplicity. The resistance, however quiet, however deniable, however apparently trivial, was the refusal of that conversion. It was the insistence, maintained daily against considerable pressure, on being actually there. The women who were never asked. The 1901 census records the names of approximately 1.7 million domestic servants. Most of those names are attached to no other record that tells us who those people were, what they thought, what they felt, what the particular texture of their days was like, whether they were happy, angry, resigned, hopeful, or some complex mixture of all of these that resists simple description. Hannah Culwick is there. A handful of others left memoirs or were interviewed or were the subjects of investigations that recorded their testimony. A few hundred more appear in court records, in newspaper reports, in the diaries of employers who found them notable enough to mention. The rest are a census entry and a name. Their inner lives are gone, not because they didn't have them, they had them fully, the way all people have inner lives, but because the system they lived in was designed to make those inner lives irrelevant, and the design mostly worked. The irrelevance that was imposed on them in life has followed them into the historical record. This is a loss that cannot be quantified and can barely be described, but it seems important to say clearly, we do not know and now cannot know what most of these women thought about their lives. We have fragments. We have the negative space that their absence creates. We have the resistance, inferable from the complaints of the employers, which tells us something about what they felt even when it doesn't tell us what they said. But we don't have the voices, not most of them, and the voices were there. They talked in the kitchen, in the servants' hall, in the park on Sunday afternoons. They talked to each other about what this was like, what they wished were different, what they planned to do when they got out, whether they thought they would get out. They laughed. There must have been laughter. There is always laughter in any shared human situation, especially shared misery, and the laughter is gone too. The silence we face now looking for them is the same silence that was imposed on them then. What they became, the women who left domestic service in the 1900s and 1910s and 1920s, became other things. They became factory workers, and in the factories, they built the labor movements that would eventually, slowly, incompletely, but genuinely, reshape the relationship between workers and employers in the 20th century. Women's labor in the trades union movement owes something specific to the generation that came out of domestic service and into industries where collective action was possible in ways it never had been below stairs. They became, in smaller numbers, clerks and shop workers and nurses and teachers, and eventually everything else. The daughters of Victorian servants were, in many cases, the women of the Edwardian and interwar middle class, not because the middle class expanded to include them entirely, but because the economic and educational mobility of the early 20th century moved faster than anyone in 1870 would have predicted. The generation that had worked in the kitchen, their bodies bent over the range and the coal scuttle and the scrubbing brush, produced daughters who sat in offices and sons who went to university and grandchildren who, in some cases, had never worked in a domestic servant capacity and would not recognize the life if you described it to them. This is not a straightforward triumph. The transformation came with its own costs and its own injustices, and the class inequality that domestic service expressed did not disappear when domestic service changed form. It simply reorganized itself around different markers. The 20th century has its own hierarchies, its own versions of the hidden labor, its own invisible workers. But the specific Victorian arrangement, the live-in servant, the character reference, the servant stare, the bell, that arrangement ended. And what ended it was, in large part, the slow accumulation of refusals that we have been calling, throughout this script, the silent rebellion. The house that remains. I want to end somewhere specific. You can still walk down a Victorian terraced street in London and look at the front of the houses. The main entrance, reached by steps that go up. The tradesman's entrance, reached by steps that go down. The two doors, the two worlds, the two planes of a single building. Inside many of these houses, if you know what to look for, you can still find the servants' bells, sometimes still mounted in their original positions, a row of small brass bells on a board in what used to be the kitchen, labeled by room, morning room, drawing room, library, master bedroom, mistress bedroom, each bell connected by wire now long defunct to a pull in the relevant room upstairs. The bells don't ring anymore. The wires are gone. The rooms they summon people from no longer serve the function they were built to serve, but the architecture is still there. The physical memory of the arrangement built into the walls of the house that still stands, that people still live in. And somewhere in the history of every one of those houses, in the decades when the arrangement was operational, there was a person who answered the bell, who came up the servants' stairs with the tray, who cleaned the grate and blacked the range and hauled the coal and made the dinner and set the fire and lived, at the bottom of the house or the top of it, in the space that was left over after the family had taken what it needed. She is not in the history books, usually. She is not in the family portrait that hangs in the drawing room. She is not in the memoir that the mistress kept, except occasionally in the margins, in the brief notations of household events. Cook gave notice. New girl arrived, seems capable. The housemaid broke in a dish. She is in the arrangement of the house. In the width of the back stairs, narrow enough to pass a single person with a tray. In the height of the basement ceiling, lower than the floors above. In the small window of the scullery, which looks out onto the area below the street, the underground world. She is in the house, and if you know what the house is saying, she has never entirely left it. Epilogue: the weight of the quiet. There is a particular quality to the history of people who resisted in ways that left no flag, no declaration, no visible monument to their resistance. The history of strikes and marches and manifestos is legible. It has dates and leaders and outcomes. It has the quality of an event that happened and can be pointed to. It has, in many cases, its own mythology. The moment the workers walked out, the day the march reached the Capitol, the signing of the agreement that changed the terms. The history of the slow work, the broken thing, the bad dinner, that history doesn't have this. It doesn't have a date or a leader or a monument. Its outcome was not an agreement but an attrition, the gradual, decades-long wearing away of a relationship that was not sustainable, by people who could not afford to challenge it openly but were not willing to simply accept it either. This kind of history is hard to see. It was designed to be hard to see. The weapons that were used required for their effectiveness that no one be quite sure they were weapons, but they were. What James Scott called it, James Scott, writing about Malaysian peasants in 1985, identified a cluster of behaviors that he called everyday forms of resistance, and what he saw in those Malaysian villages is what we have been seeing throughout this script in the Victorian kitchen. Scott's insight was that the absence of dramatic, organized, collective resistance does not mean the absence of resistance. It means that the resistance has taken a form appropriate to the power structure it is pushing against. A peasant who cannot organize a strike can slow down his work. A servant who cannot refuse her employer can make the dinner badly. A worker who cannot speak publicly can speak privately in the spaces that power cannot quite reach. The weapons of the weak are not as powerful as the weapons of the strong. They do not produce revolution. They do not produce manifestos. They produce instead a slow, sustained, invisible friction in the gears of the system. They oppose friction that the system must expend energy to overcome. Friction that costs something even when it is defeated. Friction that over time changes the conditions of the relationship even without producing a dramatic moment of change. The Victorian servant class was a class of people who were engaged for 60 years in exactly this kind of resistance. They were not heroes in the conventional sense. They were not political actors in any organized way. They were people who got up at 5 in the morning and went to bed at 10 at night, and in between did what they were told, and also quietly, persistently in the spaces that were available to them, refused to be entirely what they were told. That refusal mattered. Why this still matters, the obvious rejoinder to this chapter, the objection that a sensible person might raise. Why does it matter now? The Victorian servant class is gone. The relationship we have been describing no longer exists or does not exist in its original form. The character reference, the servant stare, the no followers rule, these are history. Why spend 40,000 words on a world that is over? Here is why. The world is not over in the sense that matters. The invisible workforce, the people who do the labor that makes other people's lives run smoothly, who are systematically undervalued, legally underprotected, and socially invisible. The invisible workforce did not disappear with the Victorian servant class. It reconstituted itself. It took new forms. It is the cleaning staff at your office, working at 6 in the morning before anyone else arrives. It is the care workers who look after the elderly and the disabled at wages that bear no relationship to the difficulty or the importance of the work. It is the delivery drivers and the food couriers and the childminders and the domestic workers who come on daily contracts in the 21st century and who do not, in many cases, have the legal protections that ordinary employees have. It is, globally, the hundreds of millions of people who do the labor that holds the world together and receive, in exchange, less than any honest accounting of their value would suggest they deserve. The specific form has changed, the structural position has not, and the forms of resistance have not changed much either. The worker who does the job adequately but not brilliantly, because brilliance is not rewarded. The worker who knows things about the workplace that management doesn't know she knows. The worker who coordinates with colleagues through channels that the employer cannot monitor. The worker who makes a formal complaint and finds that it goes nowhere and then decides that the informal option is the only option. These are the weapons of the weak. They have been in use since there were powerful people and less powerful people sharing an economic relationship, and they will be in use until that changes. Understanding them in the Victorian context is one way of understanding them in general. The bell that doesn't ring, the brass bell on the board in the kitchen of the Victorian house, is still there. It doesn't ring anymore. But there was a time when it rang, and when it rang, someone came. Not because they wanted to, not because they had no other choice, not because the character reference system and the economic vulnerability and the absence of legal protection had left them no option but to come, though all of those things were true. They came also because the dinner needed to be made and the fire needed to be lit and the house needed to run. And those things were real, and they were the people who could do them. And in the doing of those things there was, somewhere under the resentment and the exhaustion and the daily grinding invisibility, something that was theirs, a competence, a knowledge, a mastery of a world that they had made their own even when it was formally someone else's. The bell rang. They came. And they came in ways that the person who rang the bell never fully understood, carrying their knowledge, their resentment, their competence, their quiet resistance, their unspoken truths, all of it at once, up the back stairs that were not wide enough for all of them to fit. The house was theirs underneath the official story. It always was. If you have made it to the end of this one, I genuinely appreciate you. This was a long journey and a heavy one, and I hope it felt worth it. There's a lot of further reading to do on this subject, and I want to point you toward a few directions. Leonore Davidoff's work on servant and domestic life, particularly her essay on mastered service, is essential. Pamela Horn's The Rise and Fall of the Victorian Servant is comprehensive and readable. Liz Stanley's edition of Hannah Cullwick's diaries is one of the most remarkable primary source documents in Victorian social history, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. And if you want the working class voice looking back with clarity and humor, Margaret Powell's Below Stairs is exactly what it sounds like it is. If this script, this specific topic, The Quiet War Below Stairs, has left you thinking about something, I'd like to know what. Put it in the comments. That's what the comments are for. The next video is already in development. It is going to be quieter in some ways and louder in others. As always, take care of yourselves. The quiet past will be here.